So my name is Sofía del Carril. I am a professor at Universidad Austral in Argentina, and I will be moderating this workshop on publishing abroad, submitting a special issue or an edited volume. We have 3 speakers today. I'm going to introduce them shortly. What I was thinking about is that first we're going to hear from the speakers, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. If you have questions, you can do it directly to me or to everyone on the chat. If you have questions in Spanish, we are also going to take questions in Spanish, and I will translate them to our speakers. So feel free to ask all the questions you have for speakers today. Lo que les decía, bueno, bienvenidos a todos, soy Sofía del Carril de la Universidad Austral, bienvenidos a este taller sobre publicar y específicamente sobre publicar un volumen especial. Y la verdad es que la idea es que podamos escuchar de nuestros speakers. Los 3 van a estar haciendo su presentación en inglés, pero vamos a estar tomando preguntas en castellano y en inglés. Las pueden hacer al chat a todos, o si no, especialmente o específicamente a mí, y yo las tomo y después las traduzco. Así que siéntanse libres de hacer todas las preguntas que les surjan. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. We have Koen de Veder of the University of Antwerp in Belgium. We have Girdri Gigi Joku-Baezkaite of the University of Glasgow, and Joana Cortés of the University of Rosario in Colombia. Hi, Joana. Hi, all. So we're going to hear from our first speaker, Gigi, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Sophia. Thanks a lot. I shall try and share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So hi everyone. So I am the first one to open the discussion today, and I have a slides, but I always feel that slides can kill off a discussion. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of the prompts or ideas that I have on publishing special issues, and then I think Jana will give you a lot more detail, and then Koen will give you further ideas on this. So to open up, I thought I would tell you a little bit of my past experiences. So basically, what I think is important to highlight is that when we talk about publications and special issues, you don't necessarily have to do a special issue as a whole. I think there's an interesting question also about the extent to which it's worth it just being a part of a special issue. So not leading it, but basically adding your paper to the project that someone else is doing as a special issue. So I have by now done quite a few of these. So I've done one special issue, as in the one that I have been leading as a guest editor. I have taken part in a few as a contributor, and now together with Jana, we are doing a special issue in law and critique. So what I will say today will be a little bit on both sides. I want to talk about what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing a special issue as a guest editor, but also as a contributor. So just maybe one thing I wanted to start with is that I think differently than edited collections, special issues, in my experience, come in all sorts of sizes and forms and shapes. So they vary from 2-3 papers to 7-8 papers, or there was a special issue that I was involved with. Actually, it's not on the list here, that we had 14 papers. So it was a special issue made of 2 parts. So it's actually a very flexible idea of like this idea of doing a special issue. And in my experience, the way that it has been organized of a relationship between the journal, the guest editors, and the authors are different significantly in each case. And I think that's in a way the interesting part of it, but it's also something that is difficult to talk about in a very structured manner, because often the answer, if you ask how do you do a special issue, I would answer, well, it depends on the journal, depends on the topic, depends on the extent to where, on the size of the special issue that you want to put together. So what I thought I would do as an initial opening for this discussion today is I would tell you why I like special issues and also why I find them annoying. So in terms of advantages, and especially advantages as an author, so someone who is not leading the whole thing but is contributing a paper to it, my passion for special issues has to do with the fact that I really like sharing research ideas with other people. And I find that in neoliberal academia, the chances for that are shrinking. And in a way, special issues is this place where you have quite a small group of people potentially working in fairly similar or somehow related area of research, and you can sit down and have quite in-depth discussions about what exactly each one of you are writing about and what are the potential linkages with neighboring areas of law or analysis. So to me, this is the main attraction. And I think if you are not a fan of that kind of research where you engage throughout a lot, I think maybe special issues, it would appear to you quite challenging, but to me that's the main advantage. And then as I say here, the kind of the obvious advantages that follow from that is that you learn about research earlier, right? So if you're lucky and you're in a special issue with other people who are working in your area, you will know about their ideas way before everyone else, because special issues take time to reach publication. So in a way, you will be already engaging with their ideas way before everyone else. And that also helps you in a way to shape the research agenda more generally beyond your own research agenda. And in my experience, there is a slightly higher likelihood of being published. It's not guaranteed, but at least in a couple of the special issues that I have been involved with, the guest editors are involved in choosing the peer reviewers. So what it means in practice is that they will probably choose someone who is favorable in terms of your maybe kind of scholarship that you do. They will, choose someone who has a good fit in terms of methodology, in terms of critical stance. So in my experience, special issues have been successful for me in terms of publication, except the one that I have coordinated myself. That was a bit of a blow. So I have put together the whole thing, and my paper was the only one which was not accepted. So it's not 100% recipe, but by and large, I think it helps. And also it increases the visibility of your research. Now, as a guest editor, so as someone who gathers together various authors and who is trying to make the whole project happen, I personally like this idea of research leadership. And leadership maybe sounds a bit arrogant, but it's basically this idea that you shape a research question. And to me, there's something very powerful in there. So when you ask something that is interesting for you, and then you open that question to others, and those people, those authors with whom you engage, come to that question with their own interpretation of why that question is significant, then usually for me, at the end of the day, it definitely produces something more interesting and holistic than just writing a paper on the topic. So it's quite empowering in that it allows you to set a research agenda, and it gives you an ability to ask interesting questions and shape research, not only for yourself, but also for others in some respects. So for instance, for the special issue that we're doing with Joanna, now we had individual discussions with each author. And so they would tell us, okay, so this is my project, this is what I want to do, this is the kind of research that I have done in the past. And then we have a very interesting discussion about what are the questions that have not been asked in the literature so far, and what is the direction where the paper could go. So this is not the case with all special issues. Some are much more hands-off and people can be less involved. But in my experiences, the collaborations that work the best were the ones where there were a lot of discussion between authors and between the authors and the guest editor. And also, once you have done one special issue, there's usually some sort of recognition, I guess, from people in the field. They know that you have done this project, so they trust that you are able to coordinate something, and so it gives you a certain visibility, both for you as a researcher, but also as for your research publication in the end. Now moving to the less rosy part of the whole thing, I think special issues can be very annoying, and they can be very annoying because they, in my experience, take a lot of time. So in the few projects that I've been involved, the overall duration of a project, so from the idea of having a special issue to the very end of the public, when it's published in a journal, the shortest I've done was 9 months. But the longest I've done is now coming up to nearly, it's 3 years and a bit. So it can take a long time because there's a lot of reliance on other people writing at the same pace and then the same to the same schedule. And so, for instance, with the very first special issue that I've done, there were authors who were reacting very quickly, and they were responding to peer review very quickly. But there were people who were saying, I don't know, they were having babies or they were going on holiday, and there were a number of things that were happening in their lives. And in a way, special issue requires a certain number of papers for it to go ahead. So if 1 out of your 4 authors have not submitted, then you cannot go ahead with the whole project. So there is a lot more coordination required and a lot more trust in the fact that other people will do their work. It also takes time because in order to propose a special issue, you need to write an initial proposal, which often requires a draft introduction. And then at the end of the day, once you have submitted the whole thing, you probably have to rewrite your introduction from the scratch because papers have changed, people have changed. And so there is, in a way, this double writing of the introduction. And I had the experience in my academic career that this introduction is not necessarily very useful in terms of being a research output. So you cannot say, look, I had this amazing new idea in the introduction, because introduction by definition sets out the problem and explains what other people have done. So it can be, on the one hand, an interesting thing to do. It helps you to think of the trends in the area. It helps you to tie together various different research, but it's not necessarily a novel research in and of itself. So all this writing that you have done on the introduction might not necessarily bring you the brownie points at the end when it comes to, I don't know, applying for promotion or looking for a job. But in my experience, generally having the special issue on your research portfolio, I don't know if you want to use that term, usually helps in that people think that, okay, this is someone who likes to work together with others and who can coordinate research for others as well as themselves. But ultimately, for me, it boils down to this question about whether you are a team person. So do you like to work in a team, or do you prefer to work individually? And I think if you like to work in a team, if you find academia a bit lonely, as I do sometimes, a special issue for me is definitely one of the ways around it. So just a few tips in terms of putting together a special issue, and I'll just go through them quickly because I think Joanna will have much more interesting things to add to this. I would suggest that because special issues can be quite time consuming and it requires a fair amount of energy, it certainly has to be a topic that you care about. So I would say it's a bad idea to just write about something just because it sounds like a good trend to engage with it. Like, I think because of, it's a bit like writing a book, you really need to care about the whole area of research in order to embark on this. In terms of choosing the journal, my experience is that it can be a bit of a challenge to find the journal that fits your project, but if you choose a journal that you read, it's going to probably, there's a high likelihood that there will be a good fit, because as I say here, if you read that journal a lot, then it's likely that the kind of research you will produce and the kind of research agenda that you will put in place will fit the journal. Then regarding the choice of authors, I think Jana will talk a bit more about this in terms of choosing the authors quite randomly and having an open call or working with someone who you know. But so far, the 2 special issues that I've worked with, in the end, I ended up working with people I have met before. And I think for me, that has always been important. And I probably would continue doing so is because of this issue of trust that I've told you about. So ultimately, when it boils down to, you know, the year 2 of a project, when everyone is really tired and have multiple you know, other commitments in the middle of a teaching year, or, you know, when it comes down to actually submitting, it really helps when you know the person and you can ask them honestly, are you actually going to submit? If so, how much time do you need? And so it really helps to do the project. I don't think they have to be your friends. I think they could just be the people who, for whatever reason, you can trust. Then, as I already mentioned previously, I think individual communication with the authors really helps. So it helps, in my case, I found it really helps to also develop your own thinking and your own research, but it also helps to build the coherence of a special issue. So the way this can be arranged is that, for instance, you have some sort of workshop. In pre-COVID times, it could be done in person maybe, but online is also fine. And then around it, you can try and sit conversations with individual people, maybe in preparation for the workshop, or after the workshop, once you had the discussion, you could suggest people, okay, would you like to chat and see how we can work on this better together. And then finally, in all of the projects that I've been involved with, we always had at least one professor involved in one way or another. And this senior colleague, as I call them, can be there a bit as a patron, so not necessarily writing a publication, but they can, for instance, be writing some sort of epilogue to a special issue, or they can be just someone who agreed to help you to get in touch with the journals, or I don't know, take part in the workshops, or they can be someone who actually contributes a paper. But in my experience, it had always really helped to get the whole project off the ground and also accepted by the journals if you involve senior colleagues at some point. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you very much. Stop share and maybe Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. We are gonna take all the questions, I think, together at the end when the 3 of you have spoken. So thank you very much for your presentations. I have a few questions myself, but I will just step and introduce Joana Cortés, that is a professor at Universidad de Rosario, that will follow. So Joana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Stephanie, for organizing this panel and inviting me to talk about special issues. I have to say that a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, I learned them from Gigi. We have been working together in a special issue, and it's been a wonderful experience for me. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is to, in a way, complement what she said based on my experience and my participation in other special issues. I'm also going to share some slides just to organize my ideas. So one of the things, I think if you're thinking about organizing a sort of a special issue or a special collection, one of the questions is how you get the papers. And so I base on my experience, and I think that it is how it works. There are at least 3 ways in which you can, get the papers. One is usually special issues. In a lot of cases, start in a workshop or in a conference panel, conference stream. So the people who organize the workshop or organize a conference stream usually ask the authors, the presenters, to if they want to get involved in a special issue. And this is a good way of, have the conversation going and take the reflections that you had during the workshop further. So this is one way of doing this. There is another way, and it's you have an idea, you want to, put together some papers about a particular topic you have already chosen. So then you can ask or present a proposal to a journal. And then if you have a yes, then you can commission the papers, the articles. Basically, there are some people working on this topic. You want to get to know what they are doing, what their research is about at the moment. So you can ask them if they want to participate and commission the papers. That's the other way. And a third way is an open call for papers. So maybe sometimes, or maybe you have seen or you have received emails from journals saying, you know, we are thinking about having a special issue on this topic. If you're interested, please. Sometimes they ask you send a title and then a preliminary abstract, or they just say, you know, this is this deadline, the submission deadline. So if you're interested, please send the paper by this date. So I'm going to talk about the advantages or disadvantages of some of this. I never participated in a special issue where the articles have been commissioned. So I'm going to talk about my experience has been organizing special issues based on workshops and open call for papers. So for instance, the special issue Gigi said or told we are organized was based on a workshop that we had in Colombia back in August 2019. The topic was resistance to development projects. So we had an open call for papers, and we received many papers basically, and we picked some of them, and we have this workshop back in Colombia. And then we asked, Sorry
to interrupt. Here there's someone in the chat asking if you could put the presentation on full screen mode.
No, sorry, I can't do it because when I do it, my computer gets crazy. I don't know why.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just...
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, that's the reason. Okay, so we organized this workshop, we received some papers, we picked some of them. At the end of the workshop, we asked the authors if they were interested in participating in a special issue. Some of them said yes, so we went ahead. But then, you know, like the good part of it is that we knew that these people were already working on the topic, and we knew that they were interested in, you know, taking the conversation further. But the problem with this, you know, way of getting the papers is that sometimes halfway, you know, some authors might drop out because maybe, you know, they need to publish the work earlier. As Gigi said, sometimes it can take a long time. Actually, this special issue, I mean, the workshop was in August 2019, and the publication date is second semester of 2022, so it's going to be a long time. So some people, you know, were discouraged when they learn the estimated publication date, so they drop out. Other people just don't have the time, they're doing their PhDs, or they're doing something else. So it means that if you start the project, the special issue project, based on papers for a workshop, you have to have like a plan B and have a list of alternative authors, and that's actually what happened in our project. So we knew some people that were working on related topics, so we invited them out basically, and they said yes, and that's how the project kept going. But you need to, you know, you have to be prepared for that, to have this plan B, and you know, keep contact them in case some of you authors drop out, or you can in a way also have a combination, you know, like papers from a workshop and also invite people, you know, are working on this on the topic. One of a disadvantage of this way of getting the papers is that, you know, maybe you're closing the door to people doing interesting research on the topic because you don't know them. So it's something that you have to be aware. You maybe and think if you want to make this sacrifice. But in overall, I feel this is a good way of doing things, and I feel this personal connection and, you know, knowing the authors is an advantage in terms of you know, the communication and commitment to the project. So I think it is a good way of doing it. The second way of doing it is an open call for papers. Actually, I'm organizing a special issue with a journal from Colombia about the rights of nature. This project, we organize a sort of workshop in advance, but we decided to have an open call for papers because we think, we have this intuition that there are a lot of things going on around the rights of nature, not just in Latin America, but in many different parts of the world. So we thought with the other guest editors that maybe it would be a good idea to have, like a broad call for papers as a way of, as a strategy to get to know people from other places and other disciplines, because we're trying to make it an interdisciplinary collection to get to know what they are doing and try to, broaden our understanding of what is happening around the rights of nature. So I think the good part of this, or of the advantage of this way of doing organizing special issues, that maybe you can, if you have the right publication, or not the publication, diffusion strategy, if you manage to reach the right people, ask them to like disseminate the information among their contacts, if you manage to maybe put the information in the websites of organizations or academic networks, maybe you're going to be lucky and you're going to get to know like very interesting research and meet people who are interested in having a conversation around the topic that you picked. But the disadvantage of doing this is that it's risky. You don't know how many papers you're going to get. You don't know the quality of the papers you're going to get. And depending on how you do it, if initially you just ask, for instance, title and abstract, then maybe there's an issue with the commitment. You don't know if these people that initially were interested then are going to drop out, and then you maybe say no to other people who were really interested, and maybe it's too late to get them involved in the special issue. So you have to be aware of these advantages and disadvantages. The other thing with the open call for paper is that you don't know the people who are interested. So this issue about the personal connection maybe can be a disadvantage, because like communication, commitment, maybe it's going to be difficult if you don't have a personal relationship with the authors. Okay, so I would like to add some tips to the list that Gigi already presented. So I think if you're interested in organizing a special collection and special issue, it is important to do some previous research, either because you're going to organize the workshop, or in any case, you'll have to write a draft of the introduction or a concept note. So you need to know what is going there, to at least to have an idea of what's the state of the art in terms of the topic that you have picked. So it is important, and I think to do this research is important because it will also help you to identify who are doing, who are the key people in this area who are doing interesting research. And maybe a good way, a good strategy is to try to reach them, either to invite them to participate in the project or ask them, to disseminate the information about the special issue that you are organizing. I think, as Gigi said, that is crucial to organize research exchanges or authors workshops. And this is crucial for the success of the project. On the one hand, having these research exchanges or authors workshops is important because it allows you to know what is happening with the papers, and it's also a good way ensure that you're going to have a coherent project, because during these research exchanges or author workshops, all the authors are going to discuss what their research questions are, what literature they are using, what is the level of progress in terms of writing the paper, and this conversation will ensure in a way that we are talking about the same things, even though usually the authors have different perspectives and right from different angles. But at least you're going to know that everybody is at least thinking about the same kind of questions, and that there is some sort of like a common literature cutting across the papers. Depending, in the project we are organizing with Gigi, we already have one authors workshop. We invited senior academics, and they were very generous and provided feedback to our the papers. And it was a very good way of ensuring that we all were thinking about the same things. Another advantage of organizing these sort of workshops is that in a way it helps in terms of commitment. So the authors know they're going to have these deadlines, they'll have to submit some progress, and in a way it's a good way of checking what is happening with the papers. I think another good tip is to organize a shared bibliography, or like build a common library using tools like Drive folder. You can put there, like key articles or books that you think should inform the papers, because, I talked to you about the main research questions that you pick when you organize the project, or that emerge during the authors' workshops. So it's a good way. It's also a good way of ensuring there is coherence and cutting across all the papers. And I think finally, it is important to set a clear timeline and to set clear expectations. Tell in terms of the timeline, these are the deadline. Of course, there is always room for negotiation and changes, because we all are busy doing other things. As you said, there are things happening in our lives, pandemics and other things going on. But it is important to have a timeline, and so it also helps in terms of commitment. And it's also important to set clear expectations. Tell the authors, this is, if publication is not up to the guest editors, because of course the papers are going to be submitted to peer review. It means that you are not the only one making a decision, but of course you are. Your job as a guest editor is to help as much as possible, but you can ensure at the end that everything is going to be published. So it's important to set clear expectations. And just to finish, so some ideas about what has to be in the timeline. So you need to set a deadline to write the concept note, or call for papers, or the draft of your initial introduction. It is important in terms of, if you're having an open call for papers, but you need some text and explanation about what the project is about, or you need at least an introduction, the research question literature that you're going to use as a way of proposing, making a proposal to a journal for the publication of a special issue. You need a deadline for submission of titles and abstracts. Usually this is a good way of starting the project. So you ask all the authors interested, or you have already contact, to send preliminary title and abstracts. Then this is what we did with Gigi. We asked them, and we set another deadline for extended outlines. We set dates for the authors' workshops and or research exchanges, deadlines for first drafts. You need to allocate some time for feedback and comments, usually at least 3 or 4 months. Is a lot of work. And yeah, as I said, as a guest editor, you want to help the authors to get their papers published, but at the same time you want to ensure that there is coherence across all the papers, that this is a holistic project. So you need to allocate some feedback, some time for feedback and comments. You need to give the authors time to incorporate the comments and submit the final papers. And you need to take into account that the journal usually will tell you how much time you should allocate for peer review, but it could be 4 to 6 months. So this is it's important to have this timeline, so you can also set clear expectations that tell the authors this is going to take around this time. And this is what I have to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna, for your presentation. Very interesting. For all of you that just joined, please feel free to ask questions through the chat, or directly to me through the chat. So we are gonna be taking questions at the end when the 3 speakers have already spoken. So with that being said, I'm gonna give Koen de Veter, I'm sorry for the pronunciation. I'm sure there's something wrong about it, of the University of Antwerp. Thank you very much for joining us today. Koen is going to be talking about publishing a special an edited volume. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, I'll focus on an edited volume. Of course, a lot of what has already been said also applies. I mean, like the timeline that was just presented is very similar when you're doing an edited volume, I think. I'll use as an example the Encyclopedia of Law and Development, which we just produced. And it's nice to be able to do that because Stephanie was a co-editor of the volume. Gigi, in fact, was an author in the book, so she has a slightly different role. And the book was published by Edward Elgar. And I know that Ben Booth will be joining you this afternoon in the second workshop. And he was our editor. He personally was the editor also for this book. And always very polite in our communication with us, but maybe this afternoon he'll complain about what we did as an editorial team, and he'll be more direct than he often was in our communication with us. So I wanted to talk briefly about how to start an edited volume, then on how to find a publisher, what might motivate publishers to have an interest in the volume that you're proposing. And then finally, something about the process of producing the volume. And then finally, a few remarks about new trends, sort of challenges to the way we do things today and how the world might change in the future, the publishing world. So using the encyclopedia as an example, how did we start? Well, we have this Law and Development Research Network that's also involved in this workshop. And the purpose of that network was to bring together people that share an interest in that field of research. And so we have within the network an annual conference, which brings together anything between 70 and a few hundred people each year to discuss this field of law and development. And it's actually from within that institution, or you could say from that series of conferences, that grew the idea of trying to do a book that would give an overview of the field, and that would also be useful for teaching purposes, hence an encyclopedia. So this started, like many other edited volumes, really from people getting together at a conference, and then a number of people that had a responsibility within the organizing institution deciding that there was enough material to try and produce a book. I think very often edited volumes start with conferences, and so one way to get into an edited volume is clearly to do a conference paper, right? And then meet people. As always, there's a networking element also in getting invited to be an author in an edited volume or in a special issue of a journal. If you start, I think, with a conference, usually there will be many more conference papers and many more conference participants than end up in the edited volume that you produce. So it's really a two-step process, where as an editor, you're already in a way, while people are presenting at a conference, assessing the paper and the presentations and thinking, well, this is a really interesting contribution that we would like to include. Or it can really be a formal two-step process where after the conference has been organized, there's a further call among the people that participated in the conference asking them for expressions of interest, whether they would want to contribute to the volume that is in a way, the outcome of a conference. So if you have such a two-step process, I think it's still useful further down the road when you actually have put together your team of authors to have an authors conference. I think authors conferences are wonderful in terms of creating coherence within an edited volume. This is one of the big challenges of an edited volume, is that they are not just separate pieces, right? That there is a commonality to the book, a vision that of the editors, but also a vision that is shared by all the contributors. And so maybe a number of questions that are referred to in all the papers, a number of general themes that help bringing coherence. I know that for publishers, coherence of an edited volume is a main concern. You know, they don't just want to do a book that has a whole number of papers that have very little connections among themselves. So I think that's an important element in convincing a publisher later on that that the book makes sense as a book, and not just as a collection of contributions. So in our case, for this encyclopedia, which had about 80 different entries, so it's short entries, but it's huge in terms of the number of authors that contributed. Because we wanted, it's on law and development, so that's a very broad field that touches upon very different areas of expertise, and also because in the network we have a specific concern that we want to organize a dialogue between the global North and the global South and have equal representation of authors from the North and the South, which is not always the case. We decided also, we, the general editors, decided to work with associate editors that helped us in finding authors. And these associate editors were, on the one hand, thematic experts, but also people with their own regional network. So we had for instance, an associate editor with who was in South Africa. We had other people who had a European background. We had an associate editor with an Asian background. And so if you want to have a global book, if that's the ambition, then I think it's also probably necessary to have in the editorial team a sort of a global outreach, or at least people that can rely on different networks and that know other people that can then and that will then result, I think, in a more balanced representation also within the book. Okay, so that was step one. Step two is how do you find a publisher? Again, in our case, Edward Elgar had been involved in the conferences that we organized that were at the basis of the book. And why was he involved? Well, on the one hand, I think some of these publishers have a strategy of visiting research institutions, right? So in my case, this is how I met Ben Booth, who you'll be seeing this afternoon. He actually came to my faculty looking for book projects. And so there are a number of big international publishers that actually go and visit research institutions that they are interested in. And then they say, well, I'm available, invite me, I'll pay for the costs to come and visit you. And I'm willing to listen to proposals on edited volumes, on monographs, and so on. So in fact, that's how I first met Ben. But apart from that, I think it's also really important to look at the profile of the publisher and to what extent that matches with the book that you want to do. For instance, Edward Elgar has a journal, publishes a journal on law and development, right? They have a series, a thematic series on that issue. So clearly, if there are precedents like that, where an author, the profile of the publisher is to say, well, we want to publish in a specific field, then that is strategically probably the best or a really good publisher to approach. So you can of course go for what you consider to be the best publisher, but it's also, I think, really valid to try and really investigate a bit what these publishers themselves see as priority areas, and that will certainly help in convincing them that your project is a valid one. Of course, another important and maybe not the most important, but still very, very important concern of publishers is the commercial value of the project, right? Will the book sell? You know, I mean, this is a free market world, right? And that can also be very, very frustrating. So you will always get questions about, if you're coming up with a proposal, what is the market for the book, right? So you have to be able to convince them that if they are going to produce the book, that the book will actually sell, right? And I know from for instance, from a colleague who is an editor of a series for Cambridge University Press. Now, one of the main concerns there is the American market. You know, they're saying hardcover books. Who's buying hardcover books these days? The Americans, right? It's very difficult to sell, to have a commercially viable hardcover book that will not sell in the United States. No? In many ways, that's awful, right? Because it means that if the American market is interested, then you have a much better chance than in other markets. And it's totally unfair, right? Because why should the American market determine which books get published or not? But it is, I know, a part of the reasoning that will happen in many publishing houses, right? So, of course, you can go against the flow, right? And say, well, I don't care. I'll go for the project, and it's really worthwhile to do that as well. But be aware that there is an aspect of selling, in convincing publishers to do an edited volume. Okay, once you have the commitment of a publisher, then the long process starts. And I think the process for an edited book is just as long, or perhaps even longer, than for a special issue. And all the frustrations that Joanna and Gigi were talking about obviously also happen when you are the editor of an edited volume. People drop out unexpectedly. People don't respect deadlines. You have to be always kind and polite in how you communicate, and nevertheless get people to produce more or less within the time limits. There's the peer review process. Again, there are, as an editor, you have choices there. You can do very detailed peer reviews where even in each paragraph there are comments, and there are people that review that way. There are others that prefer to review in terms of the, for instance, the coherence of the book, right? Where you don't go into that very detailed reviewing, but say, well, you know, we as editors would like you to make more connections in your contribution to the general theme, whatever it is of the book, and so be more gentle and less detailed in the reviewing. I think, you know, those are choices that you can make. I think for the encyclopedia, another issue is what do you do as an editor when you don't agree with what somebody's writing, right? Is everybody, I mean, is the common vision of the book, is it simply about coherence, or is there also a sort of a common message that you want to send? And in the encyclopedia, we also faced that problem, because I think the general editors as well, all the editors somehow shared a vision of law and development that our idea was that certainly the book shouldn't be primarily dealing with economic development or only with economic development, that there was a social justice component in law and development, that there was that we encouraged interdisciplinarity, because in a field like law and development not being a legal concept, but then you sometimes get contributions that are actually quite black letter law positivist in their approach, and that maybe are, you know, that if I would have written it, I wouldn't have written it that way, the contribution. So so in the beginning, our thinking had been, well, we'll take the liberty of doing small comments on after contributions, like you sometimes have done that, and it's actually quite nice for the reader to see that, okay, you leave the author, you know, you leave that person to write whatever that person wants to write, but you take the liberty of, as editors, to say, well, you know, our views are somewhat different. We gave up on doing that for reasons of time and because it was already a very complex process, and then moved all of these things to the introduction to the book, where we indicated that, you know, we didn't necessarily, what our vision was on the issue, that we didn't necessarily agree with all the views expressed, and so on and so on, but that we also valued plurality and, you know, plurality of views and so on and so on. Okay, what else do I want to say? Finally, yes, that of course the publishing world as it exists today is full of inequalities, because the main publishers are publishing in English, which creates a huge barrier for the non-English speaking world. It's much more difficult to publish internationally if you can't publish in English. So from a pragmatic view, I should probably tell all of you who are non-native speakers to make sure you get the best possible academic English, and that will immensely increase your possibilities of publishing. To think about the American market, to think about topics that are commercially attractive, and so on and so on. On the other hand, you know, you can also say, well, let's start challenging some of the ways in which the publication market is organized, right? And say, well, what about multilingual books, right? Or multilingual edited volumes and multilingual journals? What can we do to challenge the dominance of English as a publishing language? The huge cost of edited volumes, particularly if they're hard cover volumes, is also quite a big issue, because it also again means that, you know, these books go into libraries, but even, you know, again, institutions, universities that have less resources will find it much harder to buy these books. So that takes us into open access publishing as an alternative to, and maybe going away from paper and really going for books that are published only electronically. So there's an increasing number of open edition publishers, open access publishers. And maybe that's the future, right? Rather than thinking in terms of books that you can hold in your hands. Open access, of course, doesn't mean no cost. You know, if you go with a traditional publisher, it will mean that you will have to negotiate with that publisher what it costs to have an open access format, to have the, you know, suppose that it's a book that's also published on paper, what it will cost to at the same time or slightly later have an open access version that will be much more accessible. So you'll reach a much larger audience, but you'll have to pay a price. So you have to pay money to the publisher then for them to cover their loss. So in a way, we're then subsidizing publishers for, you know, so and these costs might be quite formidable. So it means that you can only do that if you have, again, a research institution behind you that can afford to pay the cost of having an open access publication, right? It's also, I think, you know, we need publishers in the global south much more than we do today, that are recognized in the same way as the publishers that are all based in the United States and in Europe. I think that's also important, and maybe they will be open access publishers, right? And again, in open access, it's not so problematic to have maybe books that are in different languages and so on. So I think, you know, we really have to start thinking seriously about doing that much more. And then that's the third step in this maybe future process, is how do we get recognition in our own universities or in our own research institutions that those kind of publications are just as valuable as publishing with Oxford or Cambridge or Hart or Edward Elgar. You know, that in terms of how you are assessed as a researcher, the criteria that are being used for promotion and all of that also acknowledge that these different forms of publishing that reach perhaps much larger audiences than a very expensive book with Cambridge, that you get recognition within your research environment, that those are valuable. And this is also, I think, something that is important for university authorities and for senior researchers that may be able to use their influence to enable up-and-coming researchers to publish in these newer formats that, as I said, are valuable in that they reach much larger audiences than the traditional publishing that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Koen, for your presentation. Very interesting, and I think there's a lot of sort of dialogue between the three speakers today, and I think some of the questions that popped up in my mind for Gigi were answered by Koen, and I think there's a lot of interesting things we can discuss. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I will read them or translate them first. And also the questions perhaps are for each of you, but if you have any interesting comment to make and you would like to add to what your colleague just said, please also jump in. So for Gigi, you mentioned that you worked in 2 special issues and that they're particularly useful for agenda setting. And in that sense, if you can recall your experience of the last special issue you worked on, and if that issue was helpful for this agenda setting, or if you can give us an example of a special issue that for you was very useful to put, an agenda on, spread the word of an agenda to a broader audience.
Thanks, Sophia. I think my answer would be definitely yes. on most of the special issues that I have been involved with, there was a certain amplifying effect. I don't know how else to put it. So I think the easiest example for me was this very first special issue that, I mean, it was really stupid. I decided to do a special issue without ever having participated in a special issue. So I had no idea what was going on for the first few months. And then, I mean, things started coming together, but it was a special issue in the Leiden Journal of International Law on the newest, at the time, it was a new framework of the World Bank. So in a way, it was just a very good opportunity because there was this new regulatory framework. Fairly few people knew about it. There was a sense that it was significant. And I think ever since, that special issue has been certainly very helpful to me. I don't know how about other authors, and that I could tell to both the people at the World Bank, but also other researchers, to say, well, actually, we have already done this analysis and here it is in one place, and just go and look it up online. And actually, going back to this open access thing, most of the journals become open access a bit later. So for instance, with that special issue, I think it's by now open access. So it's much easier to say, okay, just look it up. The papers are available online. So yeah, so I would say, especially when it comes to non-academic audiences, I think it's much easier to talk about a collection of papers than just one paper. Because I don't know, I mean, I always feel that, especially if you're a junior researcher, okay, well, I have interesting ideas, but I don't know how significant they are in the grand scheme of things. Whereas it feels like when there is a collection of papers, then you can quite legitimately say, okay, well, the group of us, you know, a significant part of people working in this area, we have this to offer, and it proposes, you know, valid critique of your policies, for instance. So I think it's much harder for the institutions and for the policymakers to not react to that somehow. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Gigi. I have two questions for Joanna. One that is more sort of practical. I will start with that one. If you have, this is from the chat from Maria Morales. Do you use a specific app or software that help you organize your research exchanges or build the common library suggested, or even if you don't use it, if you're aware of any besides Google Drive? And then we have another question that is perhaps more, you know, has to do more with the content part of it. You talked about how perhaps the call for papers was, you know, you could reach a broader audience, and that by inviting people is more like a controlled environment, right? Sort of that you already build on the network you already have. And in that sense, do you have any examples of you know, opening it through a call for papers and receiving submissions from other fields or from other, you know, other perspectives that, you know, were not the ones of your network? If you have any example of that.
Thank you, Maria, I think, for the question about the app or the software. In the special issue we're organizing with Gigi, we're not using any special software or app. We're using Google Drive, but in another project I'm working on, we're started recently to work with Trello. I think that's the name of this. It is it's a website where you can have like solo blackboards or like boards where you can have like cards with tasks, and you can assign them to different people, and you can work collaboratively. So I think it could be a good way of doing it. But in terms of you know, sharing files like you know, like articles, academic articles or books, maybe Trello is not the right one. I know there are other softwares in a couple of meetings. A number of people have mentioned them, but I don't have them in my head at the moment. So I don't remember the names, but the one I know is Trello, and we're using it, but it's not for any special issues, more, sorry, to organize a research project with people living in different countries. So that's why we found it very, very helpful. So yeah, that would be my answer for the first question. The second question, this a special issue we are organizing with a journal from Colombia on the rights of nature is the one in which we had an open call for paper. Actually, it is still time if you're interested. I don't have a clear example at the moment because we don't know how it's gonna work. I mean, this is a sort of experiment in three senses. First, because it's an open call for paper. Second, because we wrote a call for paper in a way that because we wanted to invite people from other disciplines. So we did some research about, like discussions from political ecology, what is happening in, humanities and environmental humanities around rights of nature. So we tried to write a call for papers open enough so to accommodate people from other disciplines. But this is it's going to be a challenge because sometimes, like in many cases, people, let's say anthropology, sociology are not interested in publishing in law journals, and this is a law journal. So we don't know how it's gonna, if it's gonna work. So I'll give you more information by late this year once we receive the papers and we have a look at them. The other thing is that this is an experiment because the journal accepted to publish paper in four languages: Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French. So it is a challenge in the sense that we, like the strategy, dissemination strategy is by itself a challenge. We are trying to reach organizations and people working in different countries around environmental issues and rights of nature. And then the challenge is going to be, like the peer review. We are 4 guest editors, and most of us speak, some of these languages. So this is going to make easier the initial feedback and comments process. But then I think another challenge is going to be the peer review process. So the journal, we have already identified people who can, like act as reviewers in different languages. But we don't know how it is going to work at the end. So I'll let you know later on.
Thank you, Joanna, to be continued for the second question. And then for Koen, I have 2 questions. The first one, I think, and I was wondering how this, this sort of tension between the coherence that you want to give to this edited volume and you talked about plurality of views. I think I mean, your reflections were really interesting. I was wondering if you had to change the index or the sections of the encyclopedia, or if you beforehand had a clear idea, you and your associate editors, of where the project was heading. I think it was really interesting to hear this thing about if it has to have a common vision or a common message or a common approach, and I think that's very, very interesting. So I was wondering if you had any changes on the track when you published the encyclopedia, and also what did you do, or what was the strategy once it was published? Once you got there, how did you spread the word? What would you recommend? Because it's such as the 3 of you mentioned, is such an important effort. It takes 1, 2, 3 years to put it together. So, and sometimes when we get into the finish line, we're so tired of it that it's sort of it's really interesting to think what we do with the final product. How do we amplify and just reach audiences? And so I was wondering, what was the strategy you had for the encyclopedia once it was published?
Okay, on the first question, okay, we had 7 editors in total for the encyclopedia, 3 general ones and 4 associate editors that took responsibility for a specific subfield. So in a way, there was already a quite inclusive process, I think, in determining what should be the entries in the book. There was a lot of dialogue already before we started approaching authors. On the other hand, there were also a few suggestions of entries by people that had heard about the project, you know, because we published, the network has a website. And so we announced, although it was you could say we invited people to contribute, there was a bit of an open call, not quite, at least in the sense that we published the initiative. And so some people said, but I would like to do a contribution on something, right? So then it was up to the associate editor for that, who had that particular subfield, had the responsibility for that, to take a decision on whether that entry, an entry on that topic, should be included or not. And by the way, I mean, I see that my third co-editor Gamze has also now joined the workshop. So maybe Stephanie and Gamze also want to comment a bit on the process if they would like to. I think of course we've already been challenged on why we've included some entries and others not. And one of the commentators has said, well, actually there should be a living book. And that takes us back to open access kind of, and web online publications, because he says, if you want to do an encyclopedia on law in development, and you know that the field is changing all the time and that new topics are coming up, in fact, they should be online, right? And there should be a continuing publication process where people are able to submit entries that are now missing, because it's a dynamic field. So that again challenges a bit how we traditionally publish. Yeah, and it's true, of course, for many topics that we are now, and you see that many books now have websites where that are updated by the authors to allow taking into account new, and so I think all of those things will become more and more important, perhaps in the future. Once it is published, well, the publisher in our case came up with a list of suggestions on what we could do, or you could say expectations, in terms of you have to write like a blurb, sort of like 10 or 20 lines that can be used. Again, it's marketing, yeah, for selling purposes. It's about what are you going to do to publicize the book within the network, outside of the network. What is the commitment by the people that have contributed to the book on what can you do? What they offer in return is often sort of, when the book is just published, like a reduction in the price. So there's something that you get in return. But there is clearly, I think most publishers now have a list of expectations that they will
I think we lost Koen for a bit. Let's see if we can. Bautista, ¿lo ves en línea todavía?
Sí, en línea, pero está sin cámara.
Okay. A ver si Koen comes back, he can finish. And we have a question on the chat for Gigi and Joanna. How is the relationship with the journal editors? Did you have any contacts before?
Gigi, maybe you can talk about the law and critique and talk about your other projects, and then I can talk about the other projects.
Okay, so as I said, my initial my initial special issue proposal in Leiden Journal of International Law was actually really silly because I didn't know anyone. And so I was just out of my PhD. I've just submitted, and then I decided, why don't I do this thing? So no is the answer to that question. But this is where the point of involving senior colleagues comes in, because once I started putting the whole together, I've invited a professor who is quite well, he is a very high profile contributor. And so then he knew someone, they weren't friends or anything, but they were sufficiently close so that he was able to pass on the introduction. So unfortunately, there is this networking element, I think, inevitably, where they don't necessarily want to know you, but they want some form of assurance that they're not just wasting time with you and that you will deliver in the end. And unfortunately, in academia, that means some sort of guarantee, I guess, from a more senior academic. But I suppose maybe to answer this question slightly differently is I came to academia from, I'm originally from Lithuania. I did my PhD in the UK, but I don't come to British academia with, you know, extensive network of, I don't know, people high up or anything like that. I didn't know anyone really when I joined, and also I worked for most of my PhD, so I wouldn't say I traveled much to conferences or anything like that. But once I did start attending even one or two things, then I don't know, for this particular special issue, I have, and this actually links to this other question about working with friends, I have invited to take part in the special issue the people that I met at the conferences. So none of them were my close friends. They were just people who I heard present and with whom we maybe had a discussion over the coffee break. And actually they became friends over the special issue, a lot of them. So I would say the process is in reverse. I haven't invited friends to contribute. I've invited people who I liked and admired from seeing them present, and then they became friends in that process.
Thank you. Joanna?
Okay, so I talk about the long critique project. We had the workshop before contacting any journal. So it was after we decided to have a special issue, and then we wrote the first draft of the introduction that we started to approach journals, and we approached long critique because there is a senior professor, a colleague, one of Gigi's colleagues from Glasgow, who is one of the editors. So it was a good way, you know, of reaching the journal, because Gigi already had this contact, but it was more like a sort of professional contact, as I understand. Yeah, they were colleagues in Glasgow. So that's why we approached him and presented the draft of the introduction. And this is how, I mean, he said that the journal might be interested. He presented, or we submitted the whole thing to the editorial board, and they came back, they replied saying, yes, we're interested. And I think it was also important that besides the senior academic who also works with Gigi at Glasgow, we knew other people from the editorial board. So in a way, I think it was helpful because they knew it was serious, a serious project. This is what I mean, that we were really into the project, and they knew our work. So, and they also wanted to support the approach that we were giving you because basically it's a Latin American perspective in a way. So they were also interested in publishing work and reflections based on the experiences from this region. And this is something that for them was sort of new. So that's why they also decided to support the project. In the case of the other special issue I'm working on, I know the editor because of like past work experience, and we were having these conversations about rights of nature. And so basically he invited us to be guest editors for this special issue. So it was the other way around. But the reason why he invited me and the other guest editors was because he knew that we were having conversation, and actually we had participated in a workshop on the rights of nature. So that's why he decided that maybe we could be good guest editors for this special issue.
Maybe if I can just add to this. I suppose I think it's for me, that's why it's so empowering to do special issues, because I kind of feel that once you're not working alone, then even if you don't have very good contacts, or you haven't been in particularly privileged position of having networked, you know, with all the most important people in your area, then as soon as you're submitting something not alone, you kind of acquire more weight as a researcher, as an idea. And I mean, maybe it's a bit naive, but I think that if the introduction is very good, and if there is, if the abstracts are promising, then even if you don't know the editors, they will still take it seriously, because it takes a long time to prepare the proposal well. And I have certainly heard of other colleagues who have done special issues without knowing people. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gigi. We're gonna wait a few more minutes to see if Kun just comes back, but we had a final round of questions for the three of you. One that is on the chat, that is there some challenges in working with close colleagues and friends? That's more like on a personal level and professional level as well. And another question that popped up in my mind is that we think about this interdisciplinary as a value, and we thrive to hear from different disciplines, but at the same time it's quite challenging to work with people that come from very different disciplines, because I guess they have different theoretical frameworks for the same problems, etc. So the two questions would be, what are the challenges of working with close colleagues and friends, and what are the challenges of working with authors that come from different disciplines? And the idea would be for you, Gigi and Joanna, to answer them, and so it would be nice to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so maybe I can start this time. Yeah, in terms of the challenge, it's challenging, of course, working with friends. Okay, my experience so far, it's been a way of strengthening my personal relationships and get closer to some of my colleagues. I think a way of getting around the challenges is by setting clear expectations. Telling them this is work and this is the deadlines and this is the kind of project where we envision. We are expecting commitment. We can be we can be open to negotiations, but this is an academic project, so we have to separate friendship from work. And if at some point, let's say, your paper doesn't get published, it's not our fault, because it's our interest that your paper get published. We're going to help you as much as we can as guest editors, but the responsibility is not, or the decision is not, doesn't depend on us. And there is a peer review process. So by saying that and explain that, I think you can, in a way, prevent conflicts based on, for instance, the case a paper doesn't get published. I think it would be said. I could say that. Regarding in the interdisciplinary work, yeah, it's also challenging, but I think I feel it's more, I see it more like an opportunity. For instance, in this special issue we're working on with Gigi, we have people from political ecology, people doing very, working on theory in the intersection between law and anthropology. And actually, it's been really, really interesting to work with them, because that's the way you get to know what is happening in other disciplines. And I think an important thing there is to set the research questions from the beginning. Then you in a way you can ensure that you are talking about same issues, but it's still sometimes difficult because for instance, our colleagues from anthropology or political ecology, they bring literature we didn't know, and sometimes at the beginning you don't know what they're talking about, so the conversation, the dialogue is not easy. But I feel it's nothing that you cannot solve easily, like getting involved with the literature they're presenting. And I think So there are challenges, of course, but I think I see it more like an opportunity. And I think it's been, in my case, very interesting because it has been the way in which I can have learned what's happening in other disciplines. And in a way, it has opened my spectrum, my vision about law and how law is get involved with other social institutions, let's say that.
So I have already answered a bit this question about working with friends. So I think I have not necessarily had bad experiences because most of the people I worked with were not friends as such. They were colleagues I've met somewhere. I have had a couple of friends with whom we were doing projects like this together. And in my experience, the challenging bit is towards the end of the project. So it's kind of very easy to get people excited at the start. And they, especially if you ended up talking about this idea somewhere, I don't know, with a drink or in informal setting, then the initial stages, in my experience, tend to be easier. It's towards the end when, I don't know, the reviews came back not very favorable, or there was some sort of personal issues that maybe got in the way, that's when they start sending you messages and saying, okay, look, this is what's happening in my life. And on the one hand, you want to react as a friend and say, okay, yes, I understand. On the other hand, you still have a responsibility to all the other authors. So, and yeah, in my case, it has always been the end of the project that I had to make quite difficult decisions like that. So yeah, but there's always a solution. I suppose that's in a way a bit of a testing of your friendship. No, if you should be able to openly say, okay, well, you are my friend, but you're not a part of this anymore because I can't let down other people I'm working with. And then on interdisciplinarity, as I agree with everything Jana has said, I think it's extremely challenging. Always there's a risk that you're not actually talking about the same thing. So for instance, my experience so far, I'm always fascinated about the term inclusion, like what different things it means for lawyers, anthropologists, social scientists, economists. And so you can spend the whole workshop talking about inclusion, and then someone at the end asks the question like, what do you mean by that? And then actually you've all been talking about a completely different thing. So I think there are some major challenges in terms of actually talking about the same thing, even though the words we use are the same, but literatures and backgrounds are so different that in the end of the day, once they write their piece, you're like, wow, this is nothing like that. This is not something I can understand. But I think this can be definitely overcome with these ongoing discussions. So that's why communication throughout the process is so important. And also maybe to build on my not very successful experience with an edited collection in the past, if you are doing an interdisciplinary project, you cannot have a token interdisciplinary person. So I feel it's very damaging to go, okay, so I'm writing for lawyers, so I'm going to have 5 lawyers and 1 anthropologist. I think it's very damaging for the anthropologist in that instance. So I would say if you're going for an interdisciplinarity, then be honest about it and look at your spread of authors and go, okay, well, actually, this is not really interdisciplinary. So maybe I'm just using, trendy words and are not actually doing the work that is needed for interdisciplinarity. So yeah, my experience with the edited collection, we had 20 authors, of which 3 were not lawyers. And they felt, from personal discussions with them, they felt very isolated and unhappy with us. So I think it's for the sake of the authors also. You either go the full way interdisciplinary or you don't. And that would be my take on it.
Thank you, Gigi. Hi, Kun. Hi again. We were doing a final round of questions. Maybe you can answer them now, and then we will finish with. We'll pick up on what we were talking about spreading the word and making the work in this case of an edited volume available and known for wider audiences. So the questions the chat, we had a question from the chat of what are the challenges of working with close colleagues and friends, and on one hand, and then we had another question of the challenges of working with with authors that come from different disciplines. I mean, we all value this, different, interdisciplinary, but at the same time, it's very challenging because people from different disciplines come with different backgrounds, use different theoretical frameworks that sometimes just are very, it's a challenge for the editor, and it's also a challenge for the coherence of the work itself. So if you would like to answer these two questions, challenges of working with friends and colleagues, and then challenges of working with authors from different disciplines.
Okay, thank you, and sorry that I dropped out unintentionally, I must say. On the interdisciplinarity, I think it's true that it's hard and difficult, and there I think really authors' conferences are crucial to develop a common understanding of the misunderstandings, in the sense that the same concept and term is interpreted differently very often in different disciplines, and so we think we understand each other, but we don't, because we don't take the time to define the concepts. We sort of assume that we share a common understanding, and then it takes us a long time to realize, as Gigi's example is a good example, that we actually don't understand each other. So, and I think that can only be solved really not even by reading each other's papers. It's really by entering, for me at least, into an actual dialogue with people, and then accepting that when you are writing to an interdisciplinary audience, that is different from writing for a disciplinary audience. So that you have to be ready, for instance, as a lawyer, to explain things that you wouldn't be explaining if you are writing to a purely legal audience. In order to also, I think, and you have to do that also to be able to be challenged on the way you define the concepts in your discipline. So you have to be more explicit about some things, I think, in an interdisciplinary context than you would be, and that is required from all parties around the table, right? So because one discipline is then not superior to the other, so everyone has to be willing to do it. So it's also about how the dynamics between the people develop, I think, in practice. Yeah, the friends and colleagues, I mean, there are two different categories, I think. Yeah? There's friends and there's colleagues. I think I prefer to avoid doing joint projects with, I actually prefer to put together a group of people for a project that I don't necessarily, and to do that on the basis of a shared interest, rather than on the fact that that I know people for a very long time, or that I like people, or because it's true that that creates sometimes additional complications, right? So I prefer coalitions that grow from joint interests, and of course it's helpful sometimes. I mean, it would be, I mean, to give the example, Gamze and Stephanie just did a book did an encyclopedia. We're talking about another book, right? So in that sense, it's helpful. But I think that was a pretty professional relationship that we developed, right? And it's on the basis of having worked well together that I think we could do it again, and not so much on the basis that we now know each other. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. Maybe Stephanie and Gamze would say something else, but anyway, that's the way I look at it. And in terms of what you need to do afterwards, I was almost at the end. I don't know when my connection was lost, but just to say that there are expectations clearly from the publisher, and that of course now in these COVID times, a lot of that is online events also after the book, right? I have a friend who said to me, once a book is published, it's actually dead. The dynamic phase is before you do the book. What comes afterwards is something you have to do because you want to ensure that it reaches an audience. But it's in fact less exciting in many ways than the process of producing a book. Thank you.
Thank you, Koen. Thank you, the three of you, for your time, for all your insights this morning here in this side of the world. If to say a final words, I think, and there's someone in the chat also doing a comment on in this line. I think both special issues and edited volumes are great for people from the global South. I hate talking about the global South, but I will do it for the sake of clarity. In terms of sometimes submitting an article is perhaps, you know, it's a very they are rejected because it's a very specific issue, and then perhaps coming together with an idea of a special issue or an edited volume to an editor perhaps helps, you know, bringing some, you know, topics that are being worked and discussed in academia, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and in many other places in the world. And it could be a really good proposal. It could perhaps be, you know, helpful for people that are not perhaps, you know, working in academia in Europe or in the US. So I think it's definitely helpful for everyone, but especially for people working in academia and in those regions. And finally, also, I think it went, you know, through the entire session, the importance of teamwork, of working in networks, of, you know, participating in different networks, I think is something that perhaps you didn't explicitly talk about, but I think, you know, your work and your experiences reflect that you work, you know, in networks, building networks, participating. So it was very interesting for me. I think this session will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. So I guess you can share it with people that are interested that couldn't join us together today. So thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you to our audience for being here and for all the questions. At 11:30 Argentine time, 3:30 p.m. Central time, and 2:30 p.m. London time, we'll be having a final session on publishing a book and transforming your thesis into a book with Ben Booth, Gamze Erdem Turkeli, Sharifa Sekala, and with the moderation of my colleague Angele Figueroa Corta of Austral University. So thank you very much.
Thank you for organizing. Bye.
Buenísimo. Okay, so I have a couple of people who have different names. I was just wondering if Sharifa, if you are here already, if you could, you are here. Okay, so we're going to change your name. Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're all here. The idea was to have some sort of a small chat before, but it's fine. I mean, we're going to do the way we have done the panel the next last days. So basically, we are going to ask our panelists to please present themselves and then do a short presentation, and then we will go through rounds of questions. So this is our publication seminar. It's the last panel of the last day. So thank you for still being with us. We have a discussion that is going to be on publishing a book abroad. So initially this workshop was really thought for Latin American researchers. So, so the idea is to try to facilitate the publication abroad in English to Latin American researchers. And for that, we have a luxury panel. We have, I'm going to take in the order you appear on my screen. So we have Ben Booth, who is an editor at Edward Elgar and who has supported our encyclopedia from the start, and who will talk to you about the publication process. Then we have Sharifa Sekalala, who has published different articles and books and who will explain to us how it all happened. And we also have Gamze Lemturkeli, who also has published a number of articles and books. And the idea is that we will have a focus on books. So we have discussed in the last panels articles, edited volumes, special issues, publishing locally in Latin America, publishing abroad. So this one is especially on a book and a book abroad. So I want to thank very, very much our panelists to make time for us today. And if you agree, we will start with Ben Booth. If you can present yourself, Ben, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, thank you to everybody for being here, and I'm very happy to be part of the panel today talking about the book publication process. My name is Ben Booth. I'm a publisher for academic law at Edward Elgar Publishing. So let me just share my slides with you and then we can get started. I don't know if you can see any slides yet. Can you see any slides?
We do.
You do, perfect, brilliant, okay. So yes, as I say, this panel, we're talking about the book publication process, and in particular, I'm going to focus on the particular type of book which is based around an author's thesis, because time is a little bit short. So I should mention that in fact this presentation I'm giving is based on a longer one that I might normally give over half an hour or so. So forgive me if I need to skip through a few of the sections quickly, but hopefully there will be time during the questions if you want to pick up on any point in detail. So just to quickly introduce Edward Elgar. We're an independent publisher working across law and the social sciences, publishing for a global readership. And we specialize in upper level research such as monographs and handbooks. And you might, for instance, recognize the recent encyclopedia of law and development that we've published with the Law and Development Research Network. I think it would help to begin by giving a quick overview about the scholarly publishing landscape, because it's important to set the scene for the publishing process and for your potential book project. After that, we'll have a quick look at how the process runs for commissioning and publishing a law book. And then I'll spend a little bit more time on the last section, looking perhaps at the best way to craft a successful book proposal. So thinking about the publishing landscape, you know, this picture here, I've sort of captioned the end of the book, because we live in a time where the publishing landscape has changed dramatically over the past few years, the past 10 years or so certainly, and continues to do so. And it's certainly worth thinking about the place of book publishing in that wider context. So, for example, in some disciplines like economics or harder sciences, there's been a strong trend to disincentivize book publication in favor of the journal model. And in fact, in those disciplines, there can be a very strong metricized approach to thinking about how many articles you publish and exactly where they're positioned. Obviously, within law, books continue to be important, but it is certainly the importance and the emphasis on book publication will vary from country to country and institution to institution. And set against that, we also have trends which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, such as research assessment exercises. If I mention the REF, all the UK-based participants on the call will shudder, no doubt. Trends like open access. But above all of that, what's important most of all is the standard of the scholarship and the fact that books have good content and are worth reading. So what is the publisher's role in this landscape? What does a publisher do? I suppose from the start of the process, you might think a publisher is simply reproducing the author's work? Is a publisher doing anything else than being a glorified photocopier in a sense? Well, one of my colleagues wrote a blog actually articulating 60 things that a good academic publisher should do for an author, through from assessing whether a book is pitched at the right level for its audience, through high quality production and editorial services, through to effective marketing, integrating your work with libraries infrastructure to make sure it's discoverable, and so forth. But out of all of these, we would say that the editorial selection and input is in fact key. And I would say that one of the publisher's main roles is to curate a high quality catalogue of relevant books that will make an impact on their field. So how does the process run? Books will come from different sources. Some will be initiated by an author, directly based around their research. Some maybe will be initiated by the publisher, responding to a gap in their catalogue or a need in the market. And other projects, in fact, will come about through a much more collaborative process. But whatever the origins of a particular project, the first step in the process is to develop a detailed book proposal. So this is an example of our proposal template. Most publishers who you might wish to approach will have something similar of their own, and it simply helps to gather the information that's useful when we're assessing a new book project, everything from the author's details to information about how long the book will be, who its intended readership is, and of course to explain in some detail what the goals and objectives and scope of the book are. Ultimately, the purpose of the proposal is to make a convincing case for publication, to persuade both the publisher and also independent peer reviewers that this book will make a useful and valuable addition to existing literature. I'll have a look in a moment at some of the particular details and how you might want to approach developing a successful proposal. But let's think first of all about what then happens to that proposal, the evaluation process. There are two sides to the evaluation process. There is the publisher's own considerations, which are based around both editorial questions, as we've already mentioned, about whether a book will fit well with their catalogue and whether it will make a worthwhile and valuable addition to the literature in that area. And then there are also commercial considerations that the publisher will want to consider. Is this book going to be very expensive to produce? Are there issues maybe with the language style that might be difficult to accommodate in order to develop a book that's going to be readable and accessible? Different books also have different objectives. So the publisher will be looking at the proposal in the light of the type of book that you're aiming to produce. The features that make a good textbook will be different to the features that make a good reference book. And of course, different again from those that make an engaging and thought-provoking research monograph. It's also important to bear in mind when you're thinking about the commercial dimension that perhaps what is marketable for a publisher, the type of book which will interest people, which will have relevance for their research, which will find a readership around the world, may be different to simply evaluating whether research itself is good quality and addresses an interesting but perhaps narrow question. The second part of the process is to think what peer reviewers have to say about the project. Do they rate it as being good quality scholarship? And their feedback is essential to helping the publisher understand where the book might fit in the wider literature around that area, and whether it really does present a new insight that will help take forward people's thinking in that field. But peer review is not a black and white process, so I think it's always important to keep in mind that there's an important dimension to how publishers and editors might read and understand the opinions and the feedback of different peer reviewers, perhaps those from different backgrounds, and also how you as a prospective author should react in a considered way to some of the feedback and queries that you might receive. So in a nutshell, that's the process from the origins of the idea, developing a proposal, and the publisher having an evaluation process. Let's look in a little bit more detail now at the proposal itself. So the first question to ask yourself, especially if you are in the position of working on a PhD at the moment and considering whether you want to publish your thesis, is whether in fact you really do want to write a book at this point in your career. The reasons for publishing a monograph are not the same as the reasons for celebrating a good, successful PhD thesis. You might have produced a very good thesis, but publication is not just the icing on the cake for a good piece of research. In fact, developing a good book is going to involve a lot of work, and it's the kind of project which you should undertake if you know what it is that you want to achieve. For example, will a good quality monograph at an early stage in your career be a useful stepping stone to your next step as an academic, and perhaps help to open some doors? But it's important to think about why you would want to undertake that process of writing a book. Thinking about books that are based around a PhD thesis, here are perhaps some of the points that we would look for when we're looking at the substance of the PhD itself. Does the raw material of the thesis have the makings of a good monograph? Will it make a significant contribution to its field, have relevance for an international readership? And will it meet the constraints for a well-pitched monograph? You know, for example, is the author able to express a clear message in a concise way without the book becoming overly long and technical in the process? We also will want to think about the author, because the author is a very important part of this equation. Is the author showing signs that they're proactive? Are they active in building a network for themselves by maybe attending conferences or events such as this and making connections with others who are working in their field? Are they building their reputation by giving presentations or publishing articles in relevant journals? And in fact, you know, an article publication record can be a useful indicator to a publisher about the author's ability to produce good scholarship and to write clearly on their chosen topic. It can also help to show that they're laying the foundation with people who are working in their field to prepare the way for a more substantial piece of work, such as a book. Thinking about the process of converting a thesis to a monograph, we've spoken a little bit about how a monograph itself will be different from the finished thesis. But what does that mean in detail? Well, there are a few suggestions on the screen, but I think the most important is to think about your readership, to keep your audience in mind and write for the widest possible readership, not only necessarily those who are highly familiar with the particular question that you're already thinking about. Remember that your thesis will have been written for a very small and very particular audience, your examiners, and there are certain features which are very important in a good thesis which might not be so relevant for readers of your book. For example, you may not need to go through the motions of proving that you are a diligent and capable researcher by providing an extensive literature review and referencing every point of your argument with several sources in the way that you might be expected to do for your thesis. There might be a slightly less not quite have the same expectation of such a formal writing style, for example, and more of an emphasis on clear communication instead. I think one piece of advice I once heard is to think about the book that you yourself would most want to read about your subject, and to think about those books that you've also found most useful and engaging, and give some thought to what made them appealing to you as a reader. But think about the style, think about having a coherent narrative. It shouldn't be too stop-start. We shouldn't be working through different elements of the thesis in a sort of very structured way. The book should have a good flow to it. And you might want to think about restructuring the text a bit to foreground your key arguments and the contribution that you think your research is going to make to your field. A few tips to improve your chances. I think one of the most important perhaps is to give some thought to the possible monograph before you've even finished writing the thesis. Maybe have conversations with your supervisor about whether there is material here that would suit an international level publication, and begin talking to other colleagues perhaps about the elements from your work which might be interesting and useful for those working further afield on your topic. It's certainly a good idea to get the views of somebody like your supervisor who maybe has experience of writing a monograph and writing a successful proposal, to understand the elements that are important and help to structure a good proposal. I always think that developing a good book is not necessarily about trying to trying to win a competition and get it right the first time, but rather it is a collaborative process. And I think having a good relationship with your publisher as the process goes along, but also a good relationship with people who have more experience and maybe can offer some useful advice will help to ultimately shape and craft a successful monograph that will be well received once it's published. So let's just have a look at a few different examples and see how the process might run. We have person A here, candidate A. Now, he has just defended his thesis just this last week, and all in a hurry and in a breath of excitement, he sends his manuscript straight off, in fact, to 4 leading publishers, and very proudly tells them that because it was a good quality thesis that has been successfully examined, it doesn't need any changes. It's ready to be published straight away. Despite the fact that on closer investigation, it is answering quite a specialized question, and in fact, the substance of it is dominated by one particular detailed case study. Well, I'm afraid candidate A is going to be disappointed because the publisher will probably decide that the ingredients are not there to make a successful monograph, and that is likely to be rejected at that stage. Candidate B, on the other hand, has taken a little bit more time to craft a proposal, which she sends in along with her thesis. Although, as is often the case, it's answering quite a particular question. She has given some thought to how the work might be broadened out and who it might appeal to. And there is certainly the potential there to make a reasonable monograph. So the publisher takes the next step, which is to discuss the idea with peer reviewers and find out whether the book is likely to be well received. Unfortunately, in this case, they're a little bit on the fence, and when the publisher looks at the commercial dimensions, it's possible that it could be quite an expensive book to produce. So on balance, the final decision would be not to go forward. Let's have a look at candidate C over here. She submits the proposal together with her thesis. She's taken a little bit of time to discuss it carefully with her supervisor and in fact the examiner as well, to take on board their advice. And the proposal really is very much orientated around the new monograph that she plans to write, even though it's drawing on the thesis as a foundation. So the publisher submits that to a process of peer review and in fact receives some useful feedback. The author in turn responds to that in an articulate and considered way, responding to the queries that have been raised and further tightening and developing the plans for the book together with the revised proposal. And altogether, this has been a very successful process, and the candidate is very happy to receive an offer and a publishing contract. Congratulations. So what happens next? So if you're in the fortunate position of receiving a publishing contract, you'll be pleased to know that the next step really is that we would leave you very much in peace to write the book. As a book publisher, we're always far more interested in publishing a good quality book than in rushing to meet an artificial deadline. So it's important that you take the time needed to develop a really good finished manuscript. Once it's submitted to us, we would take it through our production process, and in our case, and probably quite similarly for other international publishers, that might take around 6 or 7 months, involving copy editing and indexing and proofreading and those various stages. And then finally, when the book is published, we obviously will be keen to market your book and disseminate your work as widely as possible. And these days, that element can involve all kinds of factors which are not so obvious. In the old days, maybe we focused mostly on catalogues and your book being on display at conferences, but these days it's just as important to make sure that all the details for your book are embedded in libraries' bibliographic databases and in Google's search metadata and so forth. One question you might want to think about if you are planning to develop a monograph based around your thesis is your choice of publisher. So a few questions here that you might want to ask yourself. The first of these is probably the one that I would focus on to give some real thought to where you think your work will fit well with that particular publisher's catalogue. Look for where you think your book would be in good company alongside other people who you would like to be seen alongside, or topics which you think are also relevant to your work. But certainly do your homework and send the proposal to your first choice of publisher rather than simply the scattergun approach of approaching several people at once. One element to think about, I've put at the bottom there, is just to think about electronic publication in this day and age, and this is just a screenshot of our own online platform. I think you want to be sure that whichever publisher you choose will be capable of doing a good job with your finished book and making sure it's available in different formats, including electronic formats, to readers around the world. So to wrap up, publishing your PhD, there certainly can be pitfalls to the process of converting a thesis into a monograph, and it won't always be the best or most appropriate route for everybody. But on the other hand, it can be a worthwhile investment of time early in your career and lead to an impressive publication that will make a statement about you as a scholar and help to open doors in the future. So that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. This was extremely insightful. Maybe you can just repeat your exact title at Elgar and what you do, because I didn't present our panelists in details.
Yes, of course. So my name is Ben Booth, and I am the publisher for academic law at Edward Elgar.
Thank you, Ben. So as I said before, Ben we published an encyclopedia of law and development with Gamze Erdem Çerkeli, who is here, and Koud De Feta, who was at the former panel. And Ben was our publisher, and he really was in the process from day one. So it has been an excellent experience, and yeah, I think we can, as researchers, we can hope for this type of experiences. So the publisher is not somebody really far away and you never get to get in touch, not at all. I mean, we had a supportive relationship. I hope my colleague Gamze agreed, but I'm sure she does. Okay, so I'll go to the next panelist. And as per my screen again, I have Sharifa second. I don't know if that's fine for you. Sharifa, if you can present yourself and give us your experience as a published author and a professor.
Hi, my name is Sharifa Sekalala, and I'm an associate professor at Warwick Law School. I research mainly around global health law. And I have met Ben before. He's the first person I ever pitched a book to. And Ben was very nice, although he did reject me. But that was before I finished my PhD, so it wasn't so bad. What can I say about publishing? So I have published a book with CUP on solving global health problems and focusing on AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. And this came out of my PhD, but my PhD, as Ben said, was much, much narrower. So in my PhD, I mainly did stuff around access to medicines, and that was really quite precise and a very narrow area. And so in my talk, I'm going to talk a bit about my experience and the things that I learned from that process, and maybe think about the things that also I might do differently. I might kind of rethink if I were doing it again. So after I finished my my viva, there was a very strong recommendation from my examiners to publish a book. And I was quite keen to get it off, but I didn't immediately because I didn't have a job. And so it didn't feel like the most optimal thing to do at the time. And that, in retrospect, wasn't a bad thing, that it took me some time to kind of think about finding a job, because trying to write a good book proposal takes time. It's really time consuming to think about what it is that you want to say and how it's different. And then I just had this pressure that my research wasn't different enough from what was out there, although in retrospect it was. But I think that when you read people who are published, they kind of seem to have thought of everything and their ideas are so great. And it can make you feel very indecisive about the ideas that you do have. But I think one of the things to recognize is that if your examiners do say that you should consider publishing, they do also know the field. And so there is a degree of support that you have, not just from yourself in terms of what your ideas are, but from other people in the field. So I sent my manuscript off with my 2 reports in the end, and a proposal. And my proposal, one of my examiners had been quite keen. She was really great. She gave me quite specific advice about the things that I could do differently if it was a manuscript. And we did have a conversation again with her after the examination about how that manuscript could shape up. And I think that that's always worth doing if you've had, especially a good relationship with your examiner, to go back to them and say what would make it a distinctive book from their point of view. And she did feel that my area was narrow and it might be worth it to think about other things that had happened beyond that field. So beyond kind of access to medicines, and really think about what had happened in the law itself that was distinct. And I think that that was excellent advice for me, because it then made me go back to think about what was different about the law. And that was a good experience in terms of, again, articulating my ideas before the proposal stage, to do it with somebody who also wasn't my supervisor and was very closely connected to the book. So I then sent my manuscript off, but I still had only 1 case study when I sent my first proposal out. And then it went out to review, and then I had the feedback. And it was really interesting because I almost gave up at that point. So I had one person who thought it was an excellent proposal, but just wanted me to think about other diseases. So wanted me to go beyond AIDS and think about tuberculosis and malaria. One person who thought it was good and actually it could be published in that way. And one person who thought it was the most awful manuscript that they had ever seen. It should not be published. And they couldn't even believe that it had been sent to them for review. And that was really psychologically very problematic, because of course the person who had the most negative review had written the longest. So therefore, like, I felt like all my faults were very glaring. They called me up on really small things, like I had misspelled an author's name. And so it was very traumatic. And at that point, I nearly gave up, because I thought this one person's really was really negative. And I remember speaking to both my mentor at the time and to the person who'd examined me. And they said, perhaps you should have a phone call with the publisher. So you should have a phone call with the publisher, your commissioning editor, and see what they say, and kind of get a sense of whether you should do this work in terms of trying to then do all this extra stuff around these 2 other diseases, which you were not planning to do, because that's quite a lot of work if another publisher might have the manuscript with less work. And so I called the publisher up. She was really, really nice. And she said, well, no, we just want to know what you say to that. So don't worry about it. And as it turned out, I kind of developed a really good relationship with my commissioning editor, and I had quite a few conversations with her over the time. And I got a sense about who the 3 people were at some point and where they were positioned. And the person who had kind of said it wasn't a very, very good book, it was awful, was much more junior than the other 2. And so they kind of had more weight to what the experts in the field said. And that I thought was interesting. But I guess my point is, don't give up. If the feedback is awful, always respond just like you would to a journal article. Get traumatized, take some time, take a few days of trauma, and then try and think about constructive ways of responding to some of that critique. I think that that process can also be helpful because it can, in some ways, make you write differently when you start writing the book. Because when I started writing the book, I thought that some people were going to really hate it. And therefore, I need to make my case as compellingly as possible so that they don't hate it so much, so that when they write reviews about this book, they're not as awful. And so I did my best to kind of think about some of the things that they had said, to be as careful as I could in the manuscript, not to overclaim. So the person said, I overclaimed things, and I kind of, my grasp of the law was quite limited, and they went on. But it did mean that it changed my relationship with the manuscript when I was writing it. It made me much more considered about the claims that I was making. It made me much more thoughtful about slating pharmaceutical companies off, which I kind of did quite a lot in my earlier days. And that was interesting because when the book came out, I had it was on lots of very strange lists of pharmaceutical companies, which I found really bizarre. And so it had reviews by pharmaceutical companies who took some parts of it and still thought that there was an engagement with some of the things that they wanted to do, which I found interesting as a scholar because that's not where I would have located my work. But I think that I managed to bridge that gap and make some of those arguments slightly more nuanced, that I was in conversation with even the people who I didn't think very strongly about when I started the process. And that can feel, I think, like a sellout when you've just finished your thesis and you're so passionate about it. You've spent 4 years thinking, these people are terrible. But I think that as you develop as a scholar, some of these conversations are meaningful because we do want to remain in conversation with these people. So that was at the time of AIDS, for instance, and now we now have COVID, and we have to have some sort of conversation and engagement, even with the people that we disagree with, in order to make some headway. And so there's something there in me about moving beyond the book process and thinking about yourself as a scholar who's going to have to engage within a field and not being very dogmatic about the things that you disagree with, no matter how passionately you feel about it. And then after I was given the contract, I then had a job, I had this contract, and I think one of the things that I would say in retrospect is give yourself time to write that manuscript. So I was very keen to get the manuscript off within 12 months so that the book could be out. And there were also lots of instrumental reasons why I wanted the book to come out that quickly. In the end, I didn't. It took me, I think, slightly, it was nearer to 30 months than 12 months. And this was because of two reasons. So one, when I expanded the case studies, I needed to go away and do more work, and that needed time and deeper engagement with the book. And I think give yourself that time, because what you really want to do is to do your best work. The second thing around that was life happens. So I had a child in that time, and so I put the manuscript to one side. But don't be afraid to go to your commissioning editor and say, this is what's happening. So it took me ages. I had this idea that they would withdraw the contracts. They would say, how dare you? And none of that happened. They were really very pleasant. And as somebody told me, in the huge scheme of things, it's kind of, yeah, you're not kind of writing, I don't know, like this next bestseller. And so you have to really be, you have to, like don't take 10 years, but really think about how long that process will take and how you can do a good job. So don't feel like you have to get it out and get it out quickly. And also actually, like thinking back, that process was also good because lots of things happened that changed the area that I was operating in within the time. But it also then meant that I could update the book so that it didn't date as soon as it came out, because it was an emerging area. And so lots of things happened, and then there was a lull. And so that was really good. So it worked out very well in the end. And I think my advice is just take your time ask for longer than you think you need, because you will suddenly need it if you're going to do a good job. And go that extra mile in terms of looking for those extra case studies that people urge you to include in order to make the book broader and wider. And I think that that can be really helpful in going forward with your research, so that it's good, so that people think it's great, but also in terms of you growing. Because the strange thing about writing a book is that in some ways it is a totally new project. It's not like your PhD. And so you need that time so that you yourself can grow as a researcher and you can grow as a scholar. And then the book came out, and I think there was a lot that I think that I could, in retrospect, I could have done differently, that I have seen now, and I think I will certainly do for my next book. So like, I've noticed that lots of philosophers, for instance, have a workshop where they have people who come and speak to their book and just give them really critical feedback. But I felt that I had taken too long writing it, and therefore I needed to get it out, and it got out. But I think that if I could go back and do it again, I think I would take that time. And actually, I think that people are incredibly generous with their time. So that's the one thing that I found really surprising. So I've been to about 3 of these workshops where there's a group of scholars and some people who might be tangentially interested in the book, but they're not quite in your area, who read it and give you feedback. And it might be that everybody just reads one chapter, but I think it can be really useful for you to really harness some of those ideas and articulate them really well, but also to get people to relate with your work at a very early stage. Because I wrote my book very much as an individual. And then I found it very difficult, because it covered such a wide scope, to then go on kind of that book tour afterwards in order to engage with some of the ideas. And I think it would have been easier if I had, during the writing process, engaged with some of the people that I was aiming to reach, both to feed into my ideas, but to tell them, these are the ideas that I'm engaging with, give me some feedback. And it would, I think, also have made it a stronger book. So I'd certainly urge anybody who's thinking about the process to do that. But you can also do it at proposal stage. So you could get a few scholars that you think are really great in your area, and you could call them and send them an email. Half of them won't turn up, but you only need about 3 or 4 people to really give you constructive feedback on what the proposal looks like. And I think it really does make it stronger. So I would advise people to do it. So in the end, I ended up kind of moving from a really small area, which was like access to essential medicines for developing countries, to something that was around kind of solving global health problems. And I felt like a fraud for such a long time. So this was the publisher. They came back to me and said, well, your title is not great, and this is what we want your title to be. And in some ways, that was a good thing. It got the book into places that I think it would not have gotten it into. But I also think that the other thing that it's made me think about in my career is to think whether or not I am solving global health problems. So I've taken it beyond that point of writing that single manuscript into my career as a whole. And I'm always trying to think about ways in which law can solve global health problems. And so it can be your starting point of thinking about the kind of work that you want to do as a scholar beyond that first manuscript. And so I think that that can be a really interesting relationship with your first manuscript, of thinking about it as the beginning of the work that you kind of want to do. And that's important both in terms of the nuance and engagement with the people that you disagree with, because you will certainly have to talk to them as you go on. But it's also important that you then reiterate and ask yourself those questions beyond that first manuscript. And I think that's one of the things that I have found interesting about the journey from the manuscript in the first instance. And then perhaps the last thing that I want to engage with is kind of being really pushy about the review process. So I had this idea that when I said my book, all these people would want to read it, they'd read it immediately and they would review it. And actually it was really being quite pushy. I had to write to lots of people. I had to have lots of different book launches in different places to remind people to review it. And that's going to take time. I still have people who owe me a book review many years later, and they still say it's coming. And I think you have this thing, because it's the center of your life once you've written the book, you kind of think everybody should do this immediately. But in some ways, if you've really written a good book, and every one of you, if you get a contract, is going to write a good book, it might sometimes be that the ideas for the book have not come yet. And so I still have people who now pick up my book because my book was around soft law and think, there's no chance that we're going to sign a treaty. Trump is in the White House, and therefore we're going to have to use soft law in order to solve global health problems. And so many years later from writing the book, you're going to have people who pick up the book and its time has come, and they will be able to respond to the book in that moment. And so don't think it's too late when they do that. So ask them to review it in a particular way, whether it's just reviewing it on Twitter or reviewing it in a proper review in a journal, or recommending it on a reading list. So like, just keep that engagement of thinking it might not be time yet, but the time for the book will come. So remain optimistic. So kind of those are my thoughts about it, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sharifa. It was extremely useful too. You can imagine how Sharifa is solicited lately to talk about global health problems. So she made us a space. You can follow, she has many very interesting interventions. And if you follow her on Twitter or the IAL collective that most of us are part of, on Twitter, you will be able to see her intervention. Also on the Warwick Law School's website. I have a lot of questions, but before that, I want to leave the floor to Gamze Erdem Turkeli, as she presented me once, my favorite co-editor to the Law and Development Encyclopedia. So I'm going to leave you the floor. Gamze, can you please present yourself?
Sure.
And then give us your insights.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for everyone to be listening in this last session of the 2-week, I guess, saga. I'm Gamze Erdem Turkeli. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow of Research Foundation Flanders, that's a mouthful, at the Law and Development Research Group of the University of Antwerp. And I've actually, Stephanie and I've just co-edited the Encyclopedia of Law and Development, where Ben was our publisher, but I've also been a co-author of a commentary on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocols, again with Edward Elgar. That was with Wouter Wandenholle and my colleague Sarah Lamberts. And I've my PhD, which was turned into a manuscript, was published by Cambridge University Press. So I've sort of done 2 authored books, one co-authored and one authored, and one based on my PhD. And I will talk a little bit about the one that was based on my PhD research. And the reason why I say it like that is because it's really a different animal than the dissertation itself. So I'm going to really quickly share my screen. Okay, I don't know if I can. Does it work? Okay, I have to open my system preferences to allow for Zoom to share my screen.
Bautista está tratando, Gamze, de compartir la pantalla. No sé si.
Sí, debería poder.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I will try again because it's not working so well. But just to tell you about what my take would be, right? It's more sort of looking at the difference between what a dissertation is in terms of audience, in terms of objective, and what it is that we're trying to achieve by writing a book, if you want to go that route. And I think here what's really important is to see that it's a different. Yes. Okay, no, I can't manage, so I'm just going to talk about what I wrote in my slides, and then maybe I can send you the slides. It's very basic. But what you're trying to do in a dissertation, as I've sort of thought about it and realized, is that you're trying to reach an audience that is your examiners, as I think that Ben was already saying. It's the doctoral jury that you're trying to convince. And with the book, I felt like I was trying to reach my peers, but also practitioners, perhaps, and postgraduate students, and anyone who might be interested in what I was writing about. And the role of the book was really to communicate my research findings to these audiences, to make a compelling case for why they should take my view into account in a serious way, and sort of listen to what I had to say about this topic. And of course, when you're writing your dissertation, the consideration is purely scientific. But I think you have to recognize, even before you start pitching the book to a publisher, that the book has both scientific and commercial considerations that goes into it. And so you have to really realize that it's not just a scientific endeavor, it's also a commercial endeavor for the publisher and also for you as an author. And the objective is really, to me, it's conveying a cohesive message, an argument to audiences that are interested in your work based on what you found in your doctoral research. Whereas I think with the dissertation, it's really, you want to answer that research question that you have. There is a gap in the literature that you want to fill. And it's not always the case in the book that you can take that message to a broader audience and only take that message without building sort of a cohesive framework around it. And so in my case, actually, I'd written a long dissertation. And I'd written a dissertation that was much broader than what I ended up publishing as my book, because I wanted to look, at children's rights in relation to all these non-state development actors, economic actors that included multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the regional ones, but also business enterprises. And I wanted to bring them to a level, because they work together. I thought they were indistinguishable from a scientific perspective. But of course, when I was writing the book, the reviewer said, it's trying to do too much. The message gets lost because you're trying to include too many elements in it. And they said, well, there's stuff out there on multilateral development banks, but nothing on children's rights in business per se as a monograph. So why don't you focus on that? Because it's really sort of making your message dispersed and not really cohesive and coherent. So, and then my dissertation ended up being one book and 2 journal articles at the end. That was the outcome. And it was a good outcome, because then I was proud that I was able to present something in the book that sort of held together really well, and scientifically as well, because people kept questioning me from a legal perspective, saying, well, yes, you say this, but businesses are not international legal persons. So I had a bunch of people questioning that when I was defending my thesis. And I managed to convince them that my take on it was valid scientifically, even if they didn't agree on it. But I think a book readership is completely different in a sense, that you don't have those conversations of back and forth, and you really want something that holds together well. So I think those are some of the differences. And some of those, the considerations is, do you want to be published in a series, for instance, or not? My book wasn't a part of a series, but there are some really, really well-established series, or a track record from the publisher of publishing this. And of course, it makes a difference. So if you're a part of the series, a lot of people just approach the series editors first to see if there's space in that series. And there's now one on law and development that Elgar is hosting with editors from, well, series editors from the Law and Development Research Network, for instance. And so it really has to fit in with that perspective of that series and to really be something that can be followed by other work that's in that tradition. When you want to target a publisher, of course, it makes sense that you would go for reputable publishers with an international reach, but also sometimes some publishers are more specialized in some areas, and others are specialized in other types of areas. And sometimes in the tradition you're writing, let's say the legal tradition you're writing, there's more room in one publisher's list than another one's. And these you can only find out by having conversations with people that published or looking at their title lists of things that they've published. You can get a sense of what that might be. And then of course you have to, as I think Ben showed you, a lot of publishers, different publishers will have their own templates, but you have to sort of use that template. And I think many of those templates have really good headings of what you have to think about when because they will say, if you're a first-time author, was this your PhD manuscript, and how do you want to make that into a book and not just a dissertation? So the proposal really has to be for a book and not a rehash of what you wrote in your dissertation. And of course, I think it's by trial and error that you find your way. Because I had, when I presented a proposal, I had an idea of how to make it into a book, but I didn't want to give up on what I'd done in my sort of doctoral research, because I thought, okay, it makes a lot of sense to me. But the reviewers had other ideas, and when one of the reviewers said, "This is great," but both of them said it's too broad. It's just unmanageable. And then, if two people that you don't know, but that are in the field say this, you have to take it to heart to really question whether you're sticking to an idea because you worked on this for 4 years and you feel like you own this idea and you don't want to let it go, or is it really if you don't agree, you really have to substantiate why you don't agree. I think for the publishers also to see what your take on it is. And the question at this stage is, are you ready to first do supplementary work? Because quite often you will. I had 3 case studies and I had to add a 4th one because I had to do the book then in 2 parts on supply chains and development projects. And I had 1 case study on development projects, and it just didn't make sense to have 2 supply chain case studies and then 1. It would have been lopsided. I added another one on development projects where I was looking at children's rights in business. Are you ready to give up on some of your research that will be discarded from this project? And I'm not talking about just the literature review or the methodology parts, but really stuff that you substantively sort of labored over to say, okay, this I can't put in this book, so I'll put it somewhere else, or I won't put anywhere. I'm just going to content myself with having thought of this. And to restructure the text in a way that will take time and energy. And I think it's, as Sharifa was saying, I think you think, yes, it's, I've written all of this, so it must take me a maximum of 8 to 12 months. No, it's probably going to take you more. I think the safer sort of minimum expectation should be 1.5 years to 2 years, maybe. Depending on whether you have, what kind of position you have. If you end up doing a lectureship after you finish your PhD, if you're teaching intensively, it's not going to be on the lower side of the estimate, but towards the higher side, and even maybe higher. I was lucky to get a research position right after, and even with that, it took me about 16 months from the time defending my dissertation to submitting the manuscript. But of course, never mind, the contract to the manuscript, not the other way around. And I think 2 years from my thesis defense into then the submission of the manuscript, and then it went through, of course, copy editing and proofing and all that. So that takes additional time. And there, I think, as Sharifa and Ben were saying, I think you have to be really honest with yourself about whether you can manage to do this at that time, at that given time. Of course, it's nicer to do it while things are fresh, but sometimes it doesn't hurt to take a little time away from your dissertation, to look at it a little bit more objectively, not to feel like it's your baby that they want to, copy paste and want you to do a collage of, but really to be able to address it on its merits and to take critical distance from it. Sometimes it helps. And I found that before submitting, I reread the whole thing, and some parts I thought, okay, I'm deleting these 2 paragraphs because it's not really adding much. It may be added to the dissertation, but it's not really needed here. And of course, the last question you have to think of, and all of these questions you have to think of before proposing to publisher, I think, is there a market for it? If there's competition, what is your angle? What is your edge over the competition? To make it a publishable piece, and if it's taking a tradition forward in an additional way, in a different way, there you can say, well, these are the titles that have been published by different publishers, but here what I do differently, or what I add is this, and it doesn't exist elsewhere, and that's why it makes sense to publish, and there will be interest in it. And I think those are the kinds of questions that I didn't know, and I kind of learned by trial and error, although I had people advising me, and I'm one that doesn't have too many issues with peer review. I mean, even with journal articles, sometimes they come back with really harsh peer reviews, and I try to separate the review from the person, and then sometimes the person makes personal remarks because they don't agree with my stance. They think it's it doesn't make sense to study critically the law. This is not the law, because they have an idea of treaty law that's law, and they don't consider anything else to be of legal relevance. But then sometimes even those people that are very far away from how I look at the law are making good comments in terms of what I should address to make it to make other people read it who have a completely different idea of the field than myself. And of course, they will not agree with it, but they will say, well, her approach for her is valid and it's scientifically rigorous. And I think that's the, if, unless there's a personal vendetta, which, I haven't experienced, but I'm also too early in my career, I seem to have experienced this. But, if people look at it objectively, even if they don't agree with your approach, even if they have a completely different theoretical background or a methodological idea what the right way to do it is, it's important that you convey to them your message in a way that's rigorous, and that's not going to be in question in a way. And I think there is a conversation to be had in terms of competing views over a research question, but still a common ground of discussion, as I think Sharifa was saying. And so those would be sort of, before you go into this process, to really not underestimate the time, the effort it takes, the energy it takes, and things can go wrong. And so I think it's really important to have a good relationship, open, honest relationship with your publisher, because things like the pandemic that we didn't think would happen. And so it's important that it's not just, they're not going to be pushing you against deadlines before you're ready to submit something you're proud of submitting. And so I think it's really you have to choose carefully, and sometimes, you know, considerations might be that it's an independent one, it's not a huge one, or it's a nonprofit one. I mean, there can be considerations that you personally take on board, and it might have an impact on how you end up feeling about the process. I think it's worthwhile, you know, a worthwhile endeavor. I think, honestly speaking, career-wise, when I applied for my postdoc project, one of the, and I applied 2 months after I had submitted, or a month and a half after I submitted my thesis, so defended my thesis. And one of the reviewers came back asking, well, we don't even know where her manuscript will be published yet. And I thought, this is sort of a strange demand to make of someone who just defended 2 months ago. But of course, it has a value. I mean, for your career as well. But I think it's really important that you take your time and honestly give yourself the space to produce something that's will stand the test of time in terms of when you look back at it. You'll say, okay, you know, maybe I would have done it differently now, but for, you know, given what I know at the time and then how I could work through it, I'm happy with what I was able to come up with, and you know, still be able to defend that message you put in there. And so those would be sort of some of the practical challenges I think you have ahead. But I found that, you know, from the publisher side, I've found that most publishers are very open to dialogue, and they're very frank about what they expect in terms of, you know, whether it's a series or a standalone title, what kind of project they would expect, and kind of good at guiding you through reviewer comments as well if they think there's potential. I found that just keeping constant sort of open communication to be really beneficial in that regard, without drowning in reviewers' comments, because they tend to be really, you know, good reviewers' comments tend to be detailed and long, and I think it's helpful. You know, it's not helpful for someone to write 2 sentences saying, I think there might be something in here worth publishing. You know, that's not going to help you, but really engagement from the reviewers will help you, and I think the publishers can really help decipher those codes as well if you feel a little discouraged. I found that it's really sort of good to keep an open communication with that, and with your colleagues. If you have, you know, great colleagues who want to spend time reading it, not just your jury members, but just colleagues who, you know, work with you, if they can read the introduction or the proposal, if you can send it before sending it to the publisher. I've done it for you know, a couple of my friends. After I got the contract, they were asking me, you know, can you read this? Can you make comments? And there, you know, the people have your best interests at heart, so there are no hard feelings, and I think it might improve even before you approach the publisher to have a couple of people at least read your proposal. And those would be all from my side for the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Gamze. It was very, very useful. So I just want to insist for our audience that we are talking about publishing with the most prestigious international publishers. Sometimes in your university, you have other ways to publish. For instance, I heard about Universidad del Rosario in Colombia, Humboldt in Germany, or in my case in Geneva. If you have a good grade, then the university has a contract with a publisher, and you can publish your book after some changes that are generally much more minor compared to what was exposed before. But then it is not the most prestigious house as Elgar, Cambridge, Oxford, Hart. I don't know if Brill, for instance, follows the same process, but I would imagine it does. So I think that we need to think of what is also useful for our careers. For instance, I know that in the UK, having a book contract, as Sharifa sort of explained, and Gamze too, changes everything. I had friends sending applications around, and the day they got their book contract, they got a position. It makes a huge difference. And I mean, by book contract, I mean a book contract with those houses, those publishing houses I I mentioned. So then you have to think of the impact on your career. Some places it's not that important, other places it is. It will never hurt to have such a book contract or a book. So now I have a couple of questions. I think for us who maybe come from a different background, something that strikes us a lot is the proposal. So maybe this would be a question for Ben. So you did talk a bit of it, but you didn't have a lot of time to explain. I'm sorry. So I wanted to ask you if you can detail a bit more what you want, what you look for in a proposal. So I just finished my PhD. It went well. The supervisor is happy. The examiners are happy as far as they can be happy. And so what do I do if I want to send a proposal to you? What should I think of, etc.?
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. I think it's always a good idea. I think both Gamze and Sharifa have talked about the importance of a good relationship with a publisher. And one thing I would do is maybe take a step back from even thinking about the content of the proposal itself and thinking about having a conversation with a publisher. I know in normal times, if we were all physically present in the same place at a workshop like this, we might be able to chat over coffee. And for me as a publisher, I enjoy going to conferences and having conversations over coffee. Often you meet somebody who maybe is coming to the end of their thesis, and you can just make an introduction and you can talk a little bit about the process and you can talk a little bit about the substance of their work. I think it's completely fine to to reach out to publishers and introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your work. I've had, I don't know if it's the time of year, but I've had numerous emails this week of that nature, people just very briefly introducing themselves and the topic of their thesis and expressing some interest in putting together a book proposal and just wanting my opinion on whether that's something that might be of interest for Edward Elgar. And the answer is, in some cases, yes, it is, and maybe we can have a chat on the phone or move on quickly through a couple of emails to preparing a more detailed proposal for formal submission. And in other cases, you can very quickly say, well, this particular topic doesn't really fall within our areas of interest, or it doesn't sound as if the setup is quite right here. And that saves the author's time and perhaps spending a lot of effort trying to finesse a proposal for that particular publisher, only to find that it was never really going to be a good fit. So I think reaching out and having a conversation at an early stage can be a good way to maybe get a handle on what that publisher is looking for and which elements of your work they think sound the most interesting, and perhaps just have a one-to-one conversation with an editor from that publisher to find out what they might be looking for within the proposal in terms of the particular strengths. But I think I go back to the point that the proposal needs to make a convincing case for why the book should be published. What's really new about it? What's really, what idea is really changing our thinking about a particular question? And, the proposal needs to do a little bit more than just summarize the contents of the book in a systematic way. You need to sort of make the argument for why the world needs this book, why readers should pick this up and spend some of their time reading it. In our case, as well as having a section within the main proposal form that talks about the substance of the book, we have an addendum with some extra questions for books that are based around a thesis. And one of those will ask specifically about what elements you plan to change and modify and develop for the thesis to be suitable for a monograph. So yes, I suppose those are some of the key questions, really. What's the point of this book? What's it really telling us? What's it adding to the literature to make that case? What am I doing as an author to show the publisher and also reviewers that I understand the difference between the thesis and a finished monograph, and more specifically, what are those changes that I'm planning to make?
Thank you very much, Ben. So I think it's important to understand that these prestigious publishers have on their website generally some of the information that Ben has given us. So you will find a form or in paragraph explaining what is sought in the book proposal, and it's quite a long process. Like I have had to look once because I was in as an audience in the workshop like this, coordinated by Gamze. yeah, we did this exercise to try to create a book proposal, and it's not a small thing. It's pretty important. So Gamze, you said that somebody told you, why don't you focus on that? So I wondered who it was. Who told you, why don't you focus on that? Was it your publisher, someone like Ben?
Reviewer. It was the reviewers.
Okay.
Yeah, who thought it was too broad to make a monograph, and that it was better to and it could be 2 monographs on, you know, children's rights and multilateral development banks, and then children's rights in business. And I thought, I'm not writing 2 books. I'm just going to pick one side and stick with it. And the side that I ended up picking, of course, is the one that wasn't that much explored in literature. And then I wrote now a journal article on the other question. And so that was the reviewers really, and you could tell from, I mean, I don't know who the reviewers are to this day, but reading their reviews, I knew they were people who were from the field. You know, they were people from the trenches, and it made sense. Sort of when they said what they said, the way they explained it, it did make sense to me to really focus it on that question, because it was a broad sort of question anyhow, looking at legal obligations and responsibilities. So it wasn't sort of detracting from the overall focus that I wanted to have, but it was valid to say that it was, you know, the message, that the argument that I was trying to make was becoming muddled because of all these different components that I wanted to include, and maybe that wasn't really needed to get that message across. And I think the first time I read it, I was like, no, you know, I was really set on my ways, and then I left the reviewers for the reviews. I left them alone for a couple of days, and then I went back to reread them, and then I thought, okay, it makes sense. You know, if I'm being honest with myself, it does make sense, and it makes it a manageable, publishable size, because, you know, I'd written, I don't know, 400 some pages in my dissertation, and I had to really chop it down to half of that size, and it made sense to then shift the focus a little bit, or to sort of focus it in a little bit more in a way that was manageable.
Okay, so it means that it's a process where you need to be very flexible. So you finish your PhD, it's your baby, it has taken so much time, and then you sort of need to change it again, and I don't know, have twins or something like that, or triplets. And then you do a book proposal, and sometimes somebody tells you, why don't you focus on that? So I don't know if I can continue with my image of kids, but you have to change again. And so you need to be very, very flexible. So this is, I think this is a very important point that we can take out of all this. I have 2 questions. I don't know who would like to answer that. Maybe Sharifa. We see all this work that you have to add to your PhD. And one of my friends who published in Germany, so not in this type of editorials, told me, well, why do people not start by writing, start by writing interesting theses? If people didn't write so boring theses, then they wouldn't have so much work to do afterwards, right? So is it true, or is there a way we can avoid some of this rework? I'm going to ask Sharifa. You're muted, Sharifa, I'm sorry.
I think that the 2 things serve very different purposes. And so it's very hard to write an interesting thesis that your examiners don't think is flaky. So if I went into an examination and claimed I was going to solve global health problems, I would kind of be laughed out of the room, because people would be like, how can you do that? There would be lots of like really hard questions around legal regimes and complexity that I would really struggle to answer. And in some ways, by making your thesis quite precise, you can then skate around some of those questions, because you then have some sort of method by which you have done it. While I think in a book, you have a bit more leeway And perhaps that's good, because then that gives you perhaps that scope of being radical in a way in which you perhaps cannot be within the context of a thesis.
You are saying that there is no way around it, basically, that you can't write a thesis that would require less work. Or maybe not always, depending on your topic. I don't know what our two panelists think of that. Maybe Ben?
Well, I think the thing that's difficult is that each different form of writing has a different job to do. And I think, as Sharifa has said, you know, the thesis, you know, I'm not a thesis examiner myself, so, you know, forgive me if I don't hit the nail on the head here, but the thesis has a particular job to do, and it needs to, ultimately, it needs to demonstrate that as a prospective professional researcher, you have developed the skills and the capability to undertake an independent piece of research that would be up to the standard expected for publication and would be able to withstand peer review and the rigors that are expected of the academic process. And as a document that demonstrates your skills and through the medium of exploring a particular question demonstrates your abilities, you know, it's performing a different task to if I go into the library and I pull a book off the shelf that purports to tell me about a certain topic, and what I'm looking for is for the substance and the content to be communicated to me in an efficient and engaging way. And perhaps with the book, I'm happy to have a book that stimulates my thinking and prompts me to explore new avenues and think about new questions. With a thesis, it's maybe essential that I come to a conclusion that answers my hypothesis and sort of fulfills the format of scientific inquiry. So I think intrinsically it's very difficult, and I have to be really honest and say, as a publisher, I'm always wary if somebody comes to me and says, it's okay, I wrote my thesis as a book so it doesn't need any changes, because intrinsically there are going to be some elements that are necessary to sort of pass that examination, if you like, of the PhD that are different from what would be ideal in a good monograph.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a sentence I heard a lot when listening to those advices in converting a PhD thesis into a book, was start with your conclusions. So start with your conclusions, like basically turn the book upside down, start with your conclusions, and that will help. Maybe Gamze, you want to say something on that?
Yeah, I think that's not bad advice at all. I think if I think about it, implicitly, I guess I've done that. So what is your argument, right? That this is, if you're writing a book, and if it's, you know, if you're writing any piece of anything, I think whether it's nonfiction, fiction, or, you know, or this kind of academic work, that there is either explicitly or implicitly a message behind it. There's a reason why you're writing this. And I think in the thesis, it can't come across as much because you will be told, okay, you need to take scientific distance from the reason why you're doing this research, and to come up with a question and then really look at every different avenue and then come up with your own, you know, response to that question. But I think in the book, yes, and I very much rewrote sort of everything. Because I think the way in which my thesis developed was, okay, this is the question, this is the law. So there's a lot of description, a lot of analysis of all these different concepts like legal personality and you know, and why I want to discard it. And then, you know, and then I looked at the cases, and then in the thesis I said, what if we looked at it a completely different way? And then I proposed a theoretical framework and then applied it. And in the book, it doesn't make sense because a theoretical work, you know, framework that I'm proposing can't come at the end. No one's going to wait that long to read it. So I had to kind of take that, make that my first step. You know, what was my argument? And then take my case studies through it, because I definitely did not need to go into the literature review that people had read and people were aware of. And I was just, you know, able to turn it around and start with my conclusions as my sort of big thesis in a way, right? It's my argument. This is my argument. I argue this is what's happening, and then I'm looking at these cases, I think that supports my argument. And then when I had to sort of come up with conclusions or a way for the future, because I was looking at a field of the law that I thought was lacking, so I was sort of proposing how the law should be. And at the end, even if you were doing that in your thesis, you're asked, I wanted to look at tort law solutions, etc. I'm not a tort lawyer. So my committee asked me, like, you have to substantiate how, you understand this. So you have to do that whole background in a book. You don't have to do it. You really have to stick with your argument. And I think maybe start with your conclusions. I'm not sure, but start with your argument, and that's in a thesis to be found in your conclusions most of the time. So I think I did that exercise of rewriting and really sort of carving out my argument based on what solution I had found to this research question. And maybe that was just my my case because I was doing normative research. So maybe that has to do with it. Maybe if you're doing other types of research, that's different for you. But I think focusing on your argument is a good way to then see what needs to be changed in your thesis to make it into a monograph that reads as a scientific work, but that scientific work has an argument and has some relevance, not just to very specialist people in your area, but people who are interested, who want to pick it up and who want to engage with maybe some of the arguments and some of the parts, but not entirely, in the whole field of public international law and the law and responsibility. So I think it's not bad advice at all to start thinking about what my conclusions are, what message do I want to ultimately be sending out with this work.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharifa and Ben. I just wonder if you have something to add on this idea of turning your conclusions into the introduction, or starting with your conclusion.
I think for me, the other thing to remember is that no one is paid to, it's not like your thesis. With your thesis, people have to read it, and people don't have to read your book. There are lots of other books that they could be reading. And so you want to have a reason why you are writing this. And I think that's quite, and I think that's quite different, and it's quite a legitimate thing, both for you, but also for the readers, so that you kind of don't write something that they don't feel like reading. But also, I guess the other thing about why you need to change your thesis when you start writing a book is that it's, in some ways, there's a bit that's also about you as the author. If you go back to anything that you have ever written, you almost suddenly want to change it. So like, I look at the things that I wrote when I was a PhD student, and I was so proud of them. I thought they were amazing. They'd taken me ages, and I cringe now. And so there's part of it that's a bit like a journey that you have to, in some ways, rewrite it, because hopefully you have grown at the end of that process. And so you're going back to revisit it in order to make it better. And I think that's one of the real reasons why you should take that time to try and think about rewriting it, is because you'll almost suddenly think about your ideas in a really different way.
Thank you very much, Sharifa. I have other questions, but since we are a nice small crew, I was just wondering if somebody from the audience wants to ask a question live instead of doing it through the chat. No? You want to do it through the chat, or yes? Ignacio. Ignacio asked, has a question to ask. Okay.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for a great panel. I'm just a PhD candidate, so I'm far from having a thesis to think of publishing, but I do have a book in Spanish, so this is a bit of a change of topic, but I've written a book, a monograph in a topic on the Inter-American System of Human Rights, and I also do have a rejection from Oxford University Press to translate this book or to change it into a slightly different book to be published in English. So my question is, do you think it is interesting to try to publish research that is in a different language to make it available for a broader readership, like in English readership? The question about this particular book is that the Inter-American system of human rights is mostly studied and written in Spanish because most of the audience for this system is Latin America based, and despite the fact that there are countries like the United States, Canada, and some of the Caribbean countries that are also part of this system, it is not as known and as used as it is in the rest of Latin America, of the Americas. So maybe you can give me some insights of if you know of books that have been published in a language, and then if there is interest in having this same book or a slightly different version of the book in a different language.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Just to say, Ignacio de Casas is my colleague at Austral. He's a professor of public international law and human rights. Also, he coordinates the program of human rights at Austral. So I think it's a very interesting question because it has to do with the issue of in a way wanting to publish in an international publishing house, but who aims at an audience of the global north, right? Mainly. So what do you do if you have an issue that is more global south? I mean, I'm a bit puzzled in saying that the Inter-American system of human rights is local, but we can say it's regional in a way. So yeah, I think I would add that to Ignacio's question, and I think that's a question for Ben, definitely.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. I think, it is very interesting to think about the potential for books to cross the boundaries from one language to another, from one publishing culture to another, and I suppose, as you're pointing out, from one region to another. And as a publisher, I would take a step back in a way from saying, is this a book that deserves to be translated, and look at it afresh and say, if you were writing this book from scratch in English on this topic, is it a book that passes those various criteria? Will it connect with the readers who typically buy Elgar books? Does it fit with our catalogue? Is it a book that will have wide appeal to readers in different parts of the world? And even if it's talking about a particular region in itself, is it written in such a way that it connects in with the wider international landscape on that topic, and will help people who are interested in that particular issue to understand this region's approach and thereby learn something themselves? Is the style and the structure of the book what we would expect for a book that was written afresh in English? And that can be an issue sometimes when thinking about a book that's been first written in one language and then translated, because the academic culture in different parts of the world can vary. We've certainly got books within our catalogue that have been previously published in another language, but it can be more than the case of simply making a very straight translation. You might want to think about what the expectations of readers are in different areas, or different legal cultures as well, in terms of how you then pitch your arguments and how you make sure the work is relevant.
Thank you very much, Ben. I don't know if Gamze or Sharifa, you have something to add there.
Yeah, so I work in global health, and so I work across two very different, distinct disciplines. And I think that what Ben's saying has some traction there in terms of speaking to different disciplines and writing for them. So in the past year, suddenly I've been publishing a lot in public health journals like the Lancet or the BMJ, where the style is very different. It's kind of stripped back. It's very formulaic in a way in which law writing isn't. And I think they are suddenly issues there once you kind of move from languages that some of that applies. I'm not a native English speaker. And I think that sometimes that there are things that don't translate very well for me into the language, that I used to speak. And there's kind of that shift. But I guess my other point is, so when I approached Ben, I was a PhD student, and I still think I had a fantastic idea. But I think the other thing to think about is writing a book as a PhD student is how long is it going to take and at what cost? So in some ways you already have that book, it exists. And so part of it feels like maximizing the value of that book. But it also means that if you're going to rewrite that book, which invariably you're going to have to do, it's going to take you away from something that you're doing now. And so that thesis that you're writing now is going to be worse for it. And so, yeah, I'm grateful to Ben for saying no, because I think it then meant that my thesis was better off for just taking that time and dealing with the issues in that thesis, because what I wanted to do at that time was deal with something that was very current and very topical, but it would have taken me in a different direction from where my thesis went, because it meant in my thesis that I had to explore ideas in a fundamentally different way. And those have been slightly more durable than some of those very contemporary ideas around access to medicines might have been.
Thank you very much, Sharifa. Again, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just to say something about first of all, I wouldn't get discouraged by one rejection from one publisher because it might not have fit with their list of titles, their focus. It depends on what your focus is as well. And so my second point, my first point is that sometimes it's not a good fit. And it's not because your work isn't good. So sometimes, sometimes you have to move on to other publishers to see if there is, in fact, interest in it, because, with legal publishers as well, some would like to sort of look at, I don't know what your perspective is in the book that's in Spanish, but if it's really sort of clear cut in terms, like it's a commentary like book, then it might have a different publisher that, different publishers might be interested in that kind of thing than others. So I wouldn't be discouraged by, one publisher saying no. And it's known that, people publish with other great publishers if they are rejected by one. So it's, that's one point, I think, of, I guess, encouragement. And the second one is again, not knowing the academic tradition, but for instance, where I'm originally from in Turkey, the books that tend to look at a system or, a piece of law or a part of law tend to be very formalistic. And it's, unless you're writing a textbook of some sort on that topic, it doesn't really translate well, not in terms of language, but in terms of mentality or concept into the English-speaking sort of publishing world of top publishers, because there you would have to have your angle. You would have to have your edge over, your argument. What is your argument about the inter-American system? Do you want to look at how progressive it is compared to the European one, or how inspiring it might be in terms of the issues of jurisdiction, because it has a broader perspective on it, or the case law that's more progressive than, but then again, you're always making that comparison to make it resonate with audiences that might be more based in, in Europe or in North America, and you're making you have to have a conversation comparing it to the African system, the European system, to have an argument about why you're writing the book on the Inter-American system unless it's a textbook type of book, and I think it's a completely then different kind of. I've never written a textbook, and I think it's formidable when people take the time to dig through the case law and present something to audiences that can be used directly for teaching. Although I am writing with Walter an advanced introduction to children's rights law with Ben again, and that's supposed to be a more sort of accessible short book for postgraduate students, etc. But still in the process of writing it, so I don't know sort of that experience yet. But I think it's certainly worth having a conversation with more than one publishing house, and I've certainly had the experience that one publisher might not be a good fit for one book, but then might be a really good fit for another book that you're writing. So it really is worth checking out, with the caveat that I think Sharifa was saying, that it's going to take away time from your research, and especially if you're teaching, it's going to add to your workload in a significant way. Even if it's the research is done, even if it's you think of it as a translation, but I would second Ben that it's a new book. Even if it's the research is there, it's going to end up being unless it's a translator doing a translation of the same book and you're not involved, it's going to be probably a different book that you have to write from scratch. So that's a huge and energy commitment.
So I see that Yili's question was thoroughly answered. I thought we sort of answered it in the discussion afterwards, but I think it was answered by Ben here. Yili, if you are here, if you want to say something or ask another question, you're very welcome. Yeah, I see that you unmuted yourself. So.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Ben, for the answers. Yeah, I was thinking about in one of your slides, it was written that it's not a good idea to submit the same research book proposals, to different publishing house. I would like to ask about that. So there is a kind of internal code between the publishing houses of how it's in the practice. Thank you.
I'm going to leave this question. I don't know who wants to answer, in fact. Maybe Ben knows more about the publishing houses inside.
Sure. I'll answer that. Thanks, Yili. It's a good question, and I think it's important, obviously, as authors that you have the choice of which publisher you might want to approach for your work, and also whether you decide ultimately to accept a publishing offer if you receive one. And I think it can be tempting to think, well, maybe I'll approach 3 or 4 different publishers to give myself the best shot of getting a positive response, and perhaps if more than one is interested, I can then compare their offers and choose which one I would like to work with. And there's a rationale to that approach, but in practice, what we tend to find is that the academic world is quite a small place, and when you have 3 or 4 publishers investing the time and the effort that's needed to evaluate a book proposal, I would be very reluctant to spend the time that's needed to give that proposal proper evaluation if my sense was that the author really was hedging their bets and might prefer to publish with a different press. And in fact, I've had that experience, of course, in the past, where I've spent time working on a review process and working on the decision-making process, only to find that at the end the author then goes very quiet for a period of time and then finally pops up to say, oh, I've received a different offer and I want to publish somewhere else. It can be, it can be frustrating, and it can be difficult in terms of your future relationship with that publisher. But a more, in terms of the question of the etiquette, I think there's also a question of the fact that those publishers might be approaching some of the same reviewers. There are often a finite number of people who have the expertise to really comment on the precise topic of your work. And if you approach 4 publishers at once and they each approach 3 or 4 different reviewers, the chances are that they will be tripping over each other. And even if they're not, those reviewers are all investing considerable time to review and comment on the manuscript, really in addition to their normal duties, and very much as an act of goodwill and community investment in the wider scholarly community. So it's a little bit of an imposition on their time and their goodwill if in fact you've sent it to a certain publisher and were not really serious about perhaps working with that press. So I think going back to that point I made about having a good relationship, and the points that both Gamze and Sharifa made about having a good relationship with their editor and talking about their their proposal as it went through the process, I think what turns out to be the best way is to do some careful research on who you think is best placed to handle your book, where you would, your first choice publisher of where you would like to see it published, and of course maybe talking to colleagues who have experience to find out what the terms were like, what it was like to work with this publisher, whether they offered you a good service. But make your pick, and if you find that the process is not successful, then of course move on. And of course, we consider book proposals that maybe have been turned down by another press, and we might reach a different decision. And as Gamze was saying a moment ago, it could be very simple. It could just be to do with the profile and the nature of the catalogue of two different publishers. There can be subtle differences that maybe mean it was perfectly reasonable to approach publisher A first off, but it simply wasn't a good fit with their priorities at the moment, whereas publisher B is much happier to publish a book that maybe, let's say, appears to be slightly more specialized than publisher A was willing to undertake. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there was a problem with the quality of the book at publisher A, but it does mean that you've kept your options open, and perhaps you then find the right publisher for your book by following that path.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think that was very clear, and I think we would also have the same answer from journal editors, that you shouldn't send your article to different journals. Yes, Sharifa.
It might also be that when you are sending out something, you need to pitch it slightly differently. And so I think that that's quite important to realize that you might not send exactly the same proposal to different places. One, because one might be part of a series, and so you might be explaining why the other one might be part of a general catalog. But you also want to show the publisher that you have engaged with what they do to some extent. And so write them something that that they're going to receive, be receptive to. And so that might be another reason why you approach somebody first and then kind of wait until you've gotten a response.
Thank you very much, Sharifa. I also would like to go back to something that Sharifa said, and Gamze too, the issue of time, whether you choose to submit try to submit a book proposal, or you decide to try to convert your thesis into a book. There is some people I heard have postdoctoral scholarship of 1.5 years just to do that. So in some places, this is considered the totally valid topic, and that's what you will be doing for 1.5 years. For instance, in where I am in Switzerland, where I have my postdoc for scholarship, it would not be enough because there is this idea that you get your book out relatively quickly through Swiss publishers, and so you don't necessarily find the time to do such endeavor. So I think that the question of time is really important. I know that both Sharifa and Gamze have done their book along with many other things, including childcare, including a lot of things, but it depends on what you can manage. Also, there is a question of audience. I've heard from some of my Latin American colleagues that they really wanted open access because they were writing for Latin Americans and they knew that they didn't necessarily have the funds to buy an expensive book. So the objective was, and they wanted to be read also. So if they would publish in certain presses that do not have open access, then that would be complicated. So I guess this is something to discuss also with editors, and also to see if maybe there's a Kindle version or something like that that could be also accessed cheaper. I have a question. I think that it's going to be the last, and then I will just leave you finishing. Maybe if you have some more words to say. It's a question for Ben. I was curious because you said this is going to be an expensive book to produce. So I wondered what you meant by that. What is an expensive book to produce?
Well, it's a good question. I think a lot of our costs are closely correlated with the length of a book. So as a point of editorial principle, I like to encourage authors to think about expressing their ideas clearly and concisely, and streamlining a book from the items that are not needed. And I think that's a service to our readers, for one thing. I think everybody's time is short, and if you can communicate in a clear and concise way, then it's a much better book for it. So I think it's a good point of editorial principle. But of course, if you end up with twice as much material in a book that's making the same point, then you have twice as much cost in terms of, you know, a professional copy editor's time, a professional indexer's time, typesetting, proofreading, and not to mention production costs as well. So it all adds up to making the book more expensive to produce. And certainly if some of that length is in the form of dense footnotes, a copy editor is going to be spending longer straightening out those notes and references and checking that everything is as it should be. So, you know, that's a time-consuming process for a professional who's being paid for their time. Other items that can make a book more expensive, if you include a lot of let's say maps or charts, you know, this doesn't apply so much for law books, but you know, especially if you are trying to speak across disciplines a little bit more, which is great, and we encourage that. But you know, if you end up with more figures, charts, graphs, boxes, and things of that nature, then all of that adds to the cost of producing the book. So yes, those are the sorts of elements which can have an effect.
Okay, I'm just want to make one clarification, maybe for the audience that is not too familiar. Well, now we're all very familiar with this process, but there are the reviewers that the three panelists talked about, who are going to review your book. And then Sharifa was talking about pushing for reviews, which she meant the reviews of the book once it is published. So you would have people who would write an article in a journal about your book. So this is another type of review. She didn't say push the reviewers of the book proposal to say something. Okay, just wanted to make this very short clarification on reviewer and reviewer. So I'm going to leave you maybe each, if you want to have some closing comments on this panel, and then we will conclude. I'm going to start the other way around with Gemze. Maybe
okay,
yeah,
sure.
2 minutes,
So my sort of takeaway point was that really to you know, look inside yourself to see if you can sort of depart from your research and propose something that you know, will take your time, energy, etc. But also to realize that it's going to be another product than of your PhD research, your dissertation, and to be ready for roadblocks, etc. But also not to give up a little bit if you get, you know, a rejection or a bad review from a reviewer, and really to cultivate those relationships with the, you know, the publishers. I think that might come in handy if you want to stay in academia, not maybe for this book proposal, but in the future as well, because you will be hopefully writing and you know, writing different books, different types of books, handbooks or edited volumes, etc. So it's good to keep that relationship, to cultivate that relationship from that point onwards, even if it's not going to be for this book. I think it's worthwhile to think about the future if you want to stay in academia. And it's certainly good to also be in contact with publishers in terms of what their priorities are in the future. So so really communication, I think, with your publishers is key in understanding their expectations and whether you can meet those in the time and energy that you have.
Thank you very much, Gemze. Sharifa?
So I guess it is, in some ways, it's a fun project, but it can go on for a long time and it can seem to be not so fun. And so take some time to kind of think about it as a big body of work, sometimes take some distance from it so that you don't hate it so much, and enjoy it, because it's quite fun once it's done to kind of think you did this, it's a really great thing. So suddenly with Gamze and that, kind of persevere, respond to reviewers, even if you think they really hate your work, because you are just really thinking about this process as part of a conversation. So it's really part of a conversation with people you hopefully you respect their work, you think it's really interesting, and you're also in conversation with people as you write. So you are hopefully trying to go a bit further than your field and speaking to other people. This might be students, this might be to the general public. So really think about it as the start of a really long conversation with more than just your supervisor. So you've moved beyond a very small field to a much larger one.
Thank you very much, Sharifa. Ben?
Well, it's been really interesting, I think, hearing everybody's different insights and inputs. And what I've really enjoyed about this panel is having the perspectives from both sides of the fence, if you like, from the publisher's perspective and also the author's perspective. And nobody here has really been sticking up so much for readers, but I think, you know, they're also the third part of this equation. But I think that that notion of there being a divide between authors and publishers, and sometimes, especially for a first-time author, I think it can feel quite an intimidating process. You can feel as if you've got to get this right, and you've got to approach this esteemed publisher with a proposal that's going to strike the right note and find success and get it right the first time. And I think the most important thing I would stress is that that nature of that more collaborative nature of working. You know, I hope that by giving this kind of panel, we can help to demystify the process a little bit. We can help to reinforce the fact that a publisher shares your goals as an author of wanting to deliver a book that will make an impact on your field and that will reflect well both on you as an author and also on them as a publisher. And by working together, you stand the best chance of achieving that goal. So, you know, I would take that right back to the start and say, I hope that for anybody who has a book idea in mind, they would feel welcome to reach out, whether it's to myself or to the you know, my counterparts at other presses, but just with an exploratory email, or try and bump into them at a conference when we're able to do that again, or to have a short phone call and just discuss your idea. But the idea that it's not necessarily a test that needs to be got right, but rather a process that, if it helps to achieve your objectives, can be a rewarding and successful one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the three of you, our three panelists. Thank you very much to the audience. It has been very interesting. In fact, I just replaced Ángeles Figueroa Alcorta, who was supposed to moderate this panel and had a problem. I forgot to say that in the beginning. So I just want to say thank you again so much to everybody here. With this, we conclude our publication workshop. We conclude our doctoral workshop. And I want to also thank all the ones of you who have been here all the time. This was a really interesting process, and it was thanks to Universidad Austral, la Escuela de Gobierno, the School of Government of Universidad Austral, and Law and Development Research Network. And yeah, and many of us are member of the IEL collective, so so this is a bit the crew. So thank you so much, and let's keep in touch. Bye.